To understand the great migration that would reshape Britain, we must first journey to the misty shores and dense forests of Germania, where three proud peoples lived in harmony with land and sea. Along the peninsula of Schleswig, where cold Baltic winds whispered through reed marshes, the Angles had carved out their existence for centuries beyond count. Their very name, Angelen, spoke of the hook-shaped land they called home, a place of fjords and fishing villages, of barley fields and cattle pastures that stretched between two seas. The Angles were a people shaped by water and wind. Their settlements clustered along the coasts and riverbanks, wooden halls with high-peaked roofs that could withstand the fierce northern gales. In these halls, around fires of oak and ash, skalds would sing the ancient songs tales of heroes who had sailed beyond the sunset, of kings whose swords never knew defeat, of the gods who walked among men in the early days of the world. The greatest of these halls belonged to the kings, men whose lineages reached back through mist and legend to Woden himself, the All-Father who had given mankind the gift of poetry and the burden of war. Their ships were works of art as much as instruments of war and trade. Built from oak trees that had grown for centuries in the sacred groves, each vessel was carved with the skill passed down from father to son through generations. The dragon heads that crowned their prows were more than mere decoration. They were the spiritual guardians of the journey, carved with prayers and blessed with blood. These ships could navigate the treacherous shoals of the Baltic, ride out storms that would shatter lesser vessels, and carry their crews across the vast expanse of the North Sea when the time came for the great journey. South of Angleland, in the river valleys of what we now call Lower Saxony, the Saxons had built their own civilization. Where the Angles were shaped by the sea, the Saxons were children of the forest and the flowing river. The Weser and the Elbe watered their fields, while the vast woodlands provided timber for their halls, oak for their ships, and the sacred groves where they honoured the old gods. The very name Saxon came from their weapon of choice, the sayax, a single-edged blade that every free man carried at his side, a symbol of his independence and his readiness to defend his honour. Saxon society was built upon the bedrock of personal loyalty and collective strength. At its apex stood the kings, men who had proven their worth in battle and their wisdom in peace. These were not tyrants ruling by fear, but leaders who governed by consent, surrounded by their comitatus, the band of sworn warriors who had pledged their lives to their lord's service. Below the kings ranked the ealdormen and thegns, noble warriors who held land in return for military service, men whose halls echoed with the clash of sword on shield as they trained for the day when war would call them forth. The ceorls formed the backbone of Saxon society-free farmers who worked their own land, served in the fyrd when danger threatened, and spoke with their own voices in the local assemblies. They were bound to their lords by ties of mutual obligation rather than servitude, owing military service and agricultural labour in return for protection and the right to work the soil their fathers had tilled. At the bottom of the social order were the thralls, slaves taken in war or born into bondage, yet even they possessed certain rights protected by ancient law. Religion bound all these social ranks together in a web of shared belief and ritual practice. Woden the One-Eyed was the king of gods, the divine warrior who had sacrificed his eye for wisdom and hung 9 days upon the world tree to gain the secret of the runes. Thuna wielded his mighty hammer to protect gods and men from the giants of frost and chaos. Frigg spun the fates of mortals in her celestial hall, while Tiw governed the laws of war and justice. These were not distant, abstract deities, but active participants in the daily life of their people. Gods who demanded courage in battle, honour in peace, and generosity to one's followers. Meanwhile, on the Jutish Peninsula, where stormy seas crashed against rocky headlands, the Jutes had developed their own distinct culture. Caught between the great powers of the Angles and the Danes, they had learned to be both warriors and diplomats, raiders and traders. Their ships were perhaps the finest in all Germania, built for speed and seaworthiness, capable of crossing the North Sea in a single bold voyage. Jutish metalworkers were renowned throughout the northern world for their skill in crafting weapons and jewellery, their bronze buckles and silver brooches prized by kings and chieftains across the Germanic tribes. The push factors that would drive these peoples across the sea were already building like storm clouds on the horizon. The climate was changing, not gradually as modern climate shifts, but with the sudden violence that only geological catastrophe can bring. The great volcanic winter of 536 would dim the sun for years, killing crops, starving cattle, and forcing whole populations to seek new lands or perish. Archaeological evidence from peat bogs and ice cores tells the story that no chronicle recorded of failing harvests, abandoned settlements, and desperate journeys into the unknown. From the east came even more terrible pressures. The Hunnic Confederation under Attila was reshaping the political map of Europe, driving tribe against tribe in a cascade of migration and warfare. The Vandals, the Goths, the Lombards, all the great Germanic peoples were on the move, seeking safety in new lands as the world they had known for centuries crumbled around them. Even those who never saw a Hun felt the effects of that distant storm, as refugees flooded westward, and competition for arable land became a matter of life and death. Across the grey waters of the North Sea, Britain in the 5th century presented a picture of prosperity collapsing into chaos. For nearly 4 centuries, the island had known the peace of Roman rule, the Pax Romana that had built straight roads across the land, established cities where none had been before, and created a complex economy based on trade with the wider Mediterranean world. Roman villas dotted the countryside, their mosaic floors and hypocaust heating systems speaking of a civilization that had seemed destined to endure forever. But Rome was dying. The legions that had once seemed invincible were being withdrawn to defend the crumbling heart of the empire against barbarian invasions and civil wars. The last regular Roman troops left Britain sometime around 410, taking with them not just military protection, but the administrative apparatus that had held the province together. Into this vacuum stepped the Romano-British elite, men who had grown wealthy and powerful under Roman rule but now found themselves facing dangers they were ill-equipped to handle. The Picts from beyond Hadrian's Wall pressed southward, their painted warriors striking deep into what had been the peaceful heart of Roman Britain. From Ireland came the Scotti, raiders who would later give their name to Scotland, seeking slaves and cattle in the fertile valleys of the west. Most dangerous of all were the Germanic sea raiders who had long troubled the coast Saxons, whose very name had become synonymous with piracy and terror. It was in this desperate hour that Vortigern, whose name means simply High King, made the decision that would change Britain forever. The chronicles tell us little about this crucial figure, but what they do record paints the picture of a man trapped between impossible choices. To fight the Picts and Scots with his own forces would leave the coast defenceless against Saxon raiders. To defend the shores would expose the interior to Celtic attacks. But there was a third option, one that had been used successfully by dying empires throughout history. He would invite some of the Germanic raiders to become his allies. The invitation went out across the North Sea, carried by traders and diplomats who knew the courts of the Germanic kings. The message was simple. Come to Britain not as raiders but as foederati, federated allies who would be granted land in return for military service. Fight for us against our enemies, and we will make you rich beyond your dreams. Protect our coasts, and we will give you homes for your families, fields for your cattle, and the chance to build new kingdoms under our protection. The response was swift and decisive. From the court of the Jutish kings came 2 brothers, whose names would echo through English history, Hengist and Horsa, the stallion and the horse. Whether these were their real names or titles taken for the expedition, we cannot know. What matters is that they represented something new in the relationship between Britain and the continental Germanic peoples, not raiders seeking quick profit, but leaders planning permanent settlement. The legendary landing at Ebbsfleet on the Isle of Thanet in Kent probably occurred in 449, though the exact date matters less than the symbolic importance of the moment. 3 keels touched the shingle beach, the traditional number in Germanic legend, representing completeness and divine blessing. From those ships emerged perhaps 400 warriors and their families, the advance guard of a migration that would continue for more than a century. Archaeological evidence supports the chronicle accounts of these early settlements. At Weststow in Suffolk, excavations have revealed a complete Anglo-Saxon village dating to the 5th century, with sunken featured buildings and post-hole structures that match similar sites across northern Germany. The pottery, the metalwork, the very style of construction, all point to communities that had successfully transplanted their way of life from one side of the North Sea to the other. But perhaps the most dramatic archaeological discovery relating to this period is the ship burial at Sutton Hoo, which has revolutionized our understanding of early Anglo-Saxon society. Here, sometime in the early 7th century, a great king was laid to rest in a burial that rivals anything found in the ancient world. The helmet with its intricate decorations, the gold belt buckle weighing over a pound, the silver bowls from Byzantium, the coins from Francia, all speak of a culture that had not only survived the migration, but had flourished beyond its wildest dreams. The transformation from mercenary to conqueror was not immediate but gradual, occurring over the course of several generations. Initially, the Germanic settlers were content to serve their Romano-British employers, fighting their wars and defending their shores in return for payment and land grants. But as more ships arrived each year, as the Germanic population grew while the Romano-British elite remained static or even declined, the balance of power began to shift. The chronicle accounts speak of betrayal and treachery, of Germanic warriors turning on their employers at a great feast, but the reality was probably more complex and less dramatic. As the settlers learned the landscape, established trade connections with their kinsmen across the sea, and watched the continuing weakness of Romano-British authority, the temptation to take power for themselves became irresistible. What followed was not the sudden, catastrophic invasion that the chronicles describe, but rather a complex process of infiltration, intermarriage, and gradual cultural transformation that would continue for more than 2 centuries. The Anglo-Saxon conquest of Britain was unlike any other barbarian takeover of the late Roman world, where the Goths in Italy or the Franks in Gaul established themselves as a ruling minority over unchanged populations. The Anglo-Saxons seem to have achieved something unprecedented, the complete transformation of the ethnic and linguistic identity of eastern and southern Britain. Yet archaeological evidence suggests that this transformation was not achieved through genocide or mass displacement, but through a more subtle process of cultural assimilation and elite replacement. Romano-British material culture does not simply disappear from the archaeological record. Instead, it gradually merges with and is replaced by Anglo-Saxon styles and practices. This suggests continuity of population combined with a change in cultural identity, the Romano-Britons becoming Anglo-Saxons rather than being replaced by them. The survival of Romano-British elements can be traced in numerous aspects of Anglo-Saxon civilization. Many of the Roman towns continued to be occupied, albeit often at a reduced level. London, which the Anglo-Saxons called Lundenwitz, remained a major commercial centre throughout the period. The Roman road network continued in use, though maintenance was sporadic. Latin remained the language of the church and of scholarship, creating a cultural bridge between the Roman past and the Germanic present. Perhaps most telling is the evidence for intermarriage between the two populations. Germanic law codes from the period specified different wehrgild, blood money, payments for Anglo-Saxons and Britons, but they also provide detailed regulations for mixed marriages and inheritance rights. This suggests not segregation but integration, a society where ethnic boundaries were fluid and permeable, where a Romano-British woman might marry an Anglo-Saxon then, and their children would be fully accepted as Anglo-Saxon nobles. The creation of the first Anglo-Saxon kingdoms emerged from this complex process of settlement and assimilation. Kent, established by the Jüdisch followers of Hengist and Horsa, became the first recognisable Anglo-Saxon kingdom, its laws and customs showing a sophisticated blend of Germanic tradition and Roman administrative practice. The kingdom's wealth, derived from its strategic position controlling trade across the English Channel, allowed its kings to patronise craftsmen and scholars, creating the cultural flowering that would make Kent the entry point not just for Germanic settlers, but for Christian missionaries. Essex, the kingdom of the East Saxons, controlled the approaches to London and the rich agricultural lands of the Thames Valley. Sussex, the South Saxons, established their realm along the chalk downs and coastal plains of what is now southern England. Each of these kingdoms developed its own distinct identity, while maintaining connections with their Germanic homeland and their fellow Anglo-Saxon realms. Wessex, the kingdom of the West Saxons, began as a series of settlements along the Thames and gradually expanded westward through the downlands and river valleys of southern England. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Wessex kingdoms incorporated more Romano-British elements than their eastern neighbours, creating a culture that was recognisably Anglo-Saxon, but with distinctive features that would later give the West Saxons advantages in their struggles for supremacy. The emergence of distinct regional identities within the broader Anglo-Saxon world was perhaps inevitable, given the geography of Britain and the diverse origins of the settlers. The Angles who settled in East Anglia and eventually Northumbria brought with them cultural traditions subtly different from those of the Saxons in the south and west. The Jutes in Kent maintained connections with their homeland that gave their kingdom a cosmopolitan character unlike any other Anglo-Saxon realm. Yet beneath these regional differences lay a fundamental unity of language, law and culture that distinguished the Anglo-Saxons from both their Celtic neighbours and their continental Germanic cousins. They were no longer Angles, Saxons and Jutes, but something new, the English, the descendants of those first three keels who had crossed the grey waters in search of a new home and had found instead a new identity, a new civilization that would endure long after the last Roman legion had vanished into legend and the last Germanic kingdom had fallen to Norman knights. The world they had created by 600 was neither Roman nor purely Germanic, but something unprecedented in European history, a fusion of classical learning and barbarian vigour, Christian faith and heroic tradition, Mediterranean sophistication, and northern simplicity that would prove capable of achievements neither parent culture had imagined possible. By the dawn of the 7th century, the Great Migration had reached its natural conclusion. Where once Roman legions had marched along straight roads toward distant frontiers, now 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms stretched across the map of England like pieces of an intricate puzzle, each shaped by the geography it controlled, each reflecting the dreams and ambitions of the peoples who had carved it from the ancient landscape. This was the age of the heptarchy, though that Greek term, coined by later scholars, could never capture the rich complexity of a world where 7 royal halls echoed with the songs of 7 peoples, each believing themselves destined for greatness. In the south and west, Wessex sprawled across the chalk downs and river valleys that would one day nurture the kingdom destined to unite all England. The West Saxons had chosen their heartland well, a realm of rolling hills crowned with ancient earthworks, where spring-fed streams carved green valleys through white cliffs, and where the soil yielded harvests rich enough to support both warrior and farmer. Winchester, which they called Wintantiasta, rose from Roman ruins to become a royal city whose halls would echo with the planning of empires. The Wessex kings ruled from settlements that commanded the ancient ridgeways, those high roads that had carried trade and travellers since the days when stone circles were young. The very landscape of Wessex spoke of endurance and strength. The great chalk downs rolled like frozen waves toward distant horizons, their surfaces marked by the burial mounds of forgotten chieftains and the ramparts of hill forts that had defied Roman conquest. In the valleys between these heights, monasteries would rise to copy manuscripts and preserve learning through the darkest hours of the coming centuries. The West Saxons had found not just a kingdom, but a foundation solid as the chalk beneath their feet, enduring as the ancient stones that crowned their hills. To the north and east stretched Mercia, the Middle Kingdom whose very name proclaimed its central position in the emerging English world. From the Welsh borders to the edges of East Anglia, from the Peak District to the Thames, Mercian power would eventually extend over nearly half of what would become England. This was a realm of dense forests and fertile river valleys, where the Trent and the Severn watered fields that could support armies, and where skilled craftsmen worked precious metals into treasures worthy of emperors. The Mercian heartland lay in the valley of the Trent, where royal halls rose among meadows that flooded each spring to leave behind soil rich enough to feed thousands. From Repton and Tamworth, Mercian kings would launch the campaigns that would make their realm the dominant power of 8th century England. The kingdom's wealth came not just from agriculture, but from its position controlling the trade routes between north and south, east and west. Salt from the Cheshire Witches, lead from the Peak District, iron from the Forest of Dinal flowed through Mercian hands to enrich the royal treasuries. But Mercia's greatest strength lay in its king's understanding of power's true nature. Where other realms might depend on the prowess of a single warrior king, Mercia developed institutions that could survive royal deaths and military defeats. The Mercian administrative system, with its shires and hundreds, its reeves and judges, would provide the model for later English governance. This was not merely a kingdom, but a prototype of the state, a political entity that could adapt and endure through changing times. Far to the north, Northumbria stretched from the Humber to the Forth, a realm vast enough to be an empire, rich enough to patronize scholars whose learning illuminated all Europe. This greatest of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms was born from the union of two earlier realms, Bernicia, centred on the great fortress of Bamberg with its royal hall perched on basalt cliffs above the grey North Sea, and Dara, whose fertile plains around York had drawn settlers since the first Saxon keels touched English shores. Northumbrian power rested on the kingdom's commanding geography. The great wall that Hadrian had built still marked the northern frontier of the civilized world, but Northumbrian armies regularly crossed it to campaign in the Scottish lowlands and exact tribute from Pictish kings. Edinburgh itself was a Northumbrian fortress, its name Edwin's Burg, commemorating the king who had made the Forth a Northumbrian river. From their capital at York, which they called Eoforwis, Northumbrian kings ruled territories that stretched across two modern nations and claimed sovereignty over peoples whose ancestors had never seen a Saxon ship. The wealth of Northumbria flowed from its position controlling the trade routes between England and Scotland, but also from the kingdom's rich agricultural heartland in the Vale of York and the fertile river valleys of the Tyne and Tweed. Monasteries flourished under royal patronage, their scriptoriums producing manuscripts that combined Celtic artistry with continental learning to create works of unparalleled beauty. This was the kingdom that would give England its greatest historian in Bede, its most beautiful manuscripts in the Lindisfarne Gospels, and its most enduring traditions of scholarship and sanctity. East Anglia, the realm of the East Angles, occupied the flat fenlands and gentle hills of what would become Norfolk and Suffolk. Though smaller than its neighbours, this kingdom possessed advantages that made it wealthy beyond its size. The North Sea ports of the East Anglian coast controlled much of England's trade with the continent, bringing in silver from the Rhineland, amber from the Baltic, and luxury goods from as far away as Byzantium. The Sutton Hoo burial, with its treasures gathered from across the known world, testifies to the international connections that made East Anglian kings wealthy enough to rival emperors. The kingdom's wealth rested on more than trade. The fertile soils of East Anglia supported dense populations of free farmers, whose prosperity supported a thriving craft economy. East Anglian metalworkers were renowned throughout England for their skill in working gold and silver, their jewellery and weapons prized by kings and nobles across the Anglo-Saxon world. The kingdom's monasteries, founded with royal patronage and enriched by royal grants, became centres of learning that attracted scholars from across Europe. Kent, though the smallest of the great kingdoms, held a position of unique importance as England's gateway to Europe. Separated from Francia by only 20 miles of grey water, the Kentish coast was where most travellers from the continent first touched English soil, making the kingdom rich from customs duties and trade taxes. Canterbury, the Kentish royal city, would become the ecclesiastical capital of all England when Augustine's mission established the first archbishopric there in 597. The wealth of Kent flowed not just from trade but from the kingdom's sophisticated political organisation. Kentish law, the earliest written legal code in England, reveals a society more complex and stratified than those of the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The survival of Romano-British elements was stronger in Kent than elsewhere, creating a unique fusion of Germanic warrior culture with Mediterranean commercial sophistication. Kentish kings wore purple cloaks and gold diadems that recalled the imperial dignity of Rome, while their nobles built halls decorated with Roman mosaics and imported Mediterranean luxuries. Essex and Sussex, the kingdoms of the East and South Saxons, are sometimes called the forgotten realms of the Heptarchy, overshadowed by their more powerful neighbours yet crucial to the story of early England. Essex controlled the approaches to London and the rich agricultural lands of the Thames estuary, while Sussex dominated the chalk downs and coastal plains of southern England. Both kingdoms were wealthy enough to support royal dynasties and sophisticated material cultures, as evidenced by the rich burial goods found in their cemeteries and the impressive churches built under royal patronage. These 7 kingdoms were more than mere political entities. They were expressions of 7 different dreams of what England might become. In their royal halls, skalds sang songs that imagined futures where their particular king's descendants would rule all the English peoples. In their monasteries, monks copied chronicles that portrayed their realm's history as a straight path toward inevitable dominance. Each kingdom developed its own distinctive culture, its own artistic traditions, its own religious practices, yet all remained recognizably English, united by language and law, custom and belief. The transformation that would reshape not just England but the entire trajectory of European civilization began on a summer morning in 597, when a small band of Italian monks walked up the Roman road from the Kentish coast toward Canterbury, chanting psalms in Latin as they carried before them a silver cross and an icon of Christ the Saviour. These were not the first Christians to set foot in England. Romano-British churches had survived in the western regions. Celtic monasteries flourished beyond Hadrian's Wall, and even some Anglo-Saxon nobles had already embraced the new faith. But the mission of Augustine represented something unprecedented, a systematic, organized effort to convert an entire Germanic civilization to Christianity, backed by the full authority of the Roman Church and the personal interest of Pope Gregory the Great. The story of how this mission came to be reveals the complex web of connections that linked 7th century England to the wider world. Gregory, according to Bede's famous tale, had seen fair-haired Anglian slaves in the Roman market, and had declared them not Angles but angels, angels who deserved to hear the gospel. Whether or not this charming etymology is historically accurate, it reflects a deeper truth about the papal strategy. Rome saw the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons not as an end in itself, but as part of a grand design to reclaim northern Europe for Catholic Christianity, creating a chain of Christian kingdoms that would stretch from the Mediterranean to the Arctic Ocean. Augustine's reception at the court of Ethelbert of Kent reveals much about the sophisticated political calculations that governed 7th century royal decisions. The Kentish king was already married to Bertha, a Frankish princess who had brought her own chaplain and maintained her Christian faith throughout their marriage. This connection with the powerful Merovingian court, combined with Kent's crucial position controlling trade with the continent, made Ethelbert acutely aware of the political implications of religious choice. His conversion was not a sudden spiritual revelation, but a carefully considered decision that opened new diplomatic possibilities while strengthening existing commercial relationships. The baptism of Ethelbert on Whitsunday 597 marked a turning point not just in English religious history, but in English political development. The king's conversion brought with it access to the administrative methods of the Roman Church, including the revolutionary innovation of written law. Ethelbert's Code, the earliest written laws in any Germanic language, represents a fusion of traditional Anglo-Saxon legal principles with Roman jurisprudential concepts. These laws, inscribed on parchment rather than preserved in memory alone, could be copied, transmitted, and studied in ways that purely oral traditions could not. The Code itself reveals a society in transition between pagan and Christian values. Traditional Germanic concepts of Vergilde and blood feud remained central to the legal system, but they were now modified by Christian principles of mercy and redemption. The laws provided special protection for churches and clergy, established penalties for violations of Christian moral standards, and created legal mechanisms for the resolution of religious disputes. Most significantly, they established the principle that royal authority could be used to enforce religious conformity, a precedent that would have profound implications for the future development of English kingship. As Christianity spread beyond Kent to the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, it encountered both resistance and enthusiasm that reflected the complex religious landscape of 7th century England. In Northumbria, King Edwin's conversion in 627 came only after extensive deliberation with his councillors, including the famous debate in which one Then compared human life to a sparrow flying through a lighted hall, briefly illuminated before returning to the darkness whence it came. The Christian promise of eternal life offered an answer to this existential darkness that the old gods could not provide. Yet the triumph of Roman Christianity was not inevitable or unopposed. The crucial moment came at the Synod of Whitby in 1664, when King Oswiu of Northumbria was forced to choose between the Roman practice, brought by Augustine's successors, and the Celtic tradition that had been established by Irish missionaries. The debate ostensibly centred on the proper date for celebrating Easter, but the underlying issue was far more significant. Would English Christianity look to Rome or to Iona for its spiritual authority? The decision for Rome was made on practical as much as theological grounds. Bishop Wilfrid's argument that St. Peter held the keys to heaven carried weight, but equally important was the recognition that alignment with Roman practice would strengthen England's connections with the wider European world. The Celtic Church, for all its spiritual achievements, was essentially insular in orientation, while Rome offered access to a universal Christian civilization that stretched from Ireland to Ethiopia, from Spain to Syria. The aftermath of Whitby saw the systematic reorganization of English Christianity along Roman lines. Theodore of Tarsus, appointed Archbishop of Canterbury in 668, proved to be one of the great administrative geniuses of the early medieval period. His visitation of every English kingdom, his establishment of new bishoprics, his creation of a coherent ecclesiastical hierarchy, and his promotion of continental scholarly methods transformed the English Church from a collection of local missionary efforts into a sophisticated institutional structure capable of competing with any in Europe. Perhaps the greatest monument to this transformation was the work of Bede the Venerable at the monastery of Wearmouth Jarrow. Born into a world where literacy was rare and books were precious beyond gold, Bede devoted his life to creating a comprehensive account of how the English people had been led from paganism to Christianity. His ecclesiastical history of the English people, completed in 731, stands as one of the masterpieces of medieval historiography, combining careful research with compelling narrative to create the first truly national history written in medieval Europe. Bede's achievement went far beyond mere chronicling of events. His work established the conceptual framework within which the English would understand their own identity for centuries to come. By portraying the conversion to Christianity as the central organizing principle of English history, by showing how divine providence had guided the English from their Germanic homeland to their Christian destiny, Bede created a powerful myth of national purpose that would inspire English political development throughout the medieval period. The monasteries that flourished under royal patronage became more than centres of religious life. They were the universities, libraries and scriptoriums of Anglo-Saxon England. At Lindisfarne, monks created manuscripts whose artistic achievement rivaled anything produced in contemporary Europe. The Lindisfarne Gospels, with their intricate interlaced patterns and brilliant colours, represent a fusion of Celtic, Germanic and Mediterranean artistic traditions that could only have emerged in the unique cultural environment of Christian Anglo-Saxon England. While Augustine's Roman mission captured the attention of chroniclers and the patronage of kings, a parallel and in many ways more profound transformation was occurring in the northern and western regions of England through the work of Celtic missionaries whose spiritual fervour and scholarly achievements would leave an indelible mark on English Christianity. The light that had been kindled in Ireland during the dark centuries following Rome's collapse now began to illuminate the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms with a radiance that complemented and sometimes competed with the more structured authority of Canterbury. The story begins in 563 with Columba's self-imposed exile from Ireland to the rocky island of Iona, where he established a monastery that would become the spiritual centre of Celtic Christianity in Britain. Unlike the urban hierarchical organisation of Roman Christianity, The Celtic Church was essentially monastic in character, organised around great abbey churches whose abbots wielded authority that sometimes exceeded that of bishops. This monasticism was not a withdrawal from the world, but an engagement with it through scholarship, missionary activity, and the preservation of learning during Europe's darkest hours. When Oswald of Northumbria, seeking to consolidate his kingdom's conversion to Christianity, requested missionaries from Iona rather than Canterbury, he was choosing not just a different liturgical tradition, but an entirely different model of Christian civilization. The monk Aidan, who answered this call in 635, established his monastery on Lindisfarne, a tidal island whose twice-daily separation from the mainland created the perfect metaphor for Celtic spirituality, connected to the world yet distinct from it, accessible to all yet maintained in pristine holiness. Lindisfarne, under Aidan and his successors, became the Canterbury of the North, a centre of learning and artistic achievement that drew students and pilgrims from across Europe. The monastery's scriptorium produced manuscripts that combine the geometric complexity of Celtic art with the narrative power of Christian iconography to create works of unprecedented beauty. The Lindisfarne Gospels, created around 715 by the monk Eadfrith, represents perhaps the highest achievement of medieval book art, every page a meditation on the relationship between divine truth and human creativity. The artistic achievement of Celtic Christianity extended far beyond manuscript illumination to encompass stone carving, metalwork, and architectural innovation that transformed the visual landscape of northern England. The great stone crosses that began to appear in monastery courtyards and churchyards represented a unique fusion of Germanic memorial traditions with Christian symbolism. The Ruthwell Cross, carved sometime in the early 8th century, combines runic inscriptions in Old English with Latin texts and sophisticated sculptural scenes that tell the story of Christ's Passion with a power that transcends linguistic barriers. These monuments were not merely decorative but functional elements in a comprehensive program of Christian education designed for a largely illiterate population. The sculptural cycles that adorned church facades and cemetery crosses served as visual texts that could be read by anyone, regardless of their literacy in Latin or vernacular languages. The development of this visual vocabulary of Christian symbolism represents one of the most sophisticated educational innovations of the early medieval period. The preservation of classical learning in Celtic monasteries during the 6th and 7th centuries represents an achievement whose importance cannot be overstated. While the libraries of Rome were being pillaged by barbarian armies and the schools of Gaul were closing their doors, Irish monks were copying and studying texts of classical authors whose works would otherwise have been lost forever. When these same monks established scriptoriums in England, they brought with them not just Christian texts, but also the works of Virgil and Ovid, Cicero and Pliny, preserving the literary heritage of the ancient world for future generations. This scholarly activity was not merely preservation, but active interpretation and synthesis. Celtic scholars developed new approaches to biblical exegesis that combined traditional Irish learning with continental theological methods. Their commentaries on Scripture, their grammatical treatises, their computistical works for calculating the date of Easter, all represent original contributions to medieval scholarship that influenced intellectual development throughout Europe. Perhaps most importantly, Celtic missionaries pioneered the development of Christian poetry in the vernacular languages. Where Roman Christianity initially insisted on Latin as the only appropriate language for religious expression, Celtic tradition embraced the possibility of praising God in the tongue that had praised earthly heroes. The earliest Christian poetry in Old English, including the great works attributed to Caedmon, emerged from this Celtic willingness to sanctify the literary traditions of Germanic culture. The story of Caedmon, as told by Bede, reveals the revolutionary implications of this linguistic openness. An illiterate cowherd at Whitby Monastery, Caedmon received in a dream the gift of composing Christian poetry in the alliterative metre of traditional Germanic verse. His Hymn of Creation, the earliest surviving poem in English, demonstrates how Christian themes could be expressed using the vocabulary and poetic techniques that had previously celebrated warrior culture and pagan mythology. This vernacular Christian poetry represented more than a literary innovation. It was a fundamental reconceptualization of the relationship between sacred and secular culture. By showing that the same poetic techniques that had celebrated Beowulf's dragon-slaying could be used to praise Christ's harrowing of hell, Celtic-influenced poets created a new synthesis that made Christianity intellectually and emotionally accessible to Germanic audiences without requiring them to abandon their entire cultural heritage. The influence of Celtic Christianity extended beyond poetry to encompass legal, political and social innovations that would have lasting effects on Anglo-Saxon civilization. The concept of sanctuary, by which churches could provide legal protection to fugitives from secular justice, derived from Irish legal traditions rather than Roman precedents. The development of written vernacular laws, pioneered in Kent but elaborated throughout the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, owed much to Irish models of legal scholarship. The 7th and 8th centuries witnessed the emergence of a new type of leadership in Anglo-Saxon England, as kings who had converted to Christianity struggled to reconcile the demands of their faith with the realities of political power. This tension between the warrior ethos that had built their kingdoms and the Christian principles that now shaped their souls produced a generation of rulers whose achievements in both war and peace would define the character of medieval English kingship. Edwin of Northumbria, whose reign from 616 to 633 established the pattern for Christian kingship in England, embodied this synthesis of martial prowess and religious devotion. His court at York became a centre of learning and artistic patronage, where continental scholars worked alongside Germanic skalds to create a new cultural synthesis. Edwin's military campaigns extended Northumbrian power from the Forth to the Humber, while his peaceful administration created the prosperity that allowed monasteries to flourish and learning to advance. The famous description of Edwin's reign in Bede's history captures the ideal of Christian kingship that would inspire English rulers for centuries, a realm so peaceful that a woman carrying a newborn child could walk from sea to sea without fear of harm, so just that bronze drinking cups hung by springs throughout the kingdom were never stolen. So prosperous that even the poorest peasant could afford luxuries that had once been reserved for nobles. This vision of royal authority as a divine mandate to create earthly peace and prosperity became the theoretical foundation of medieval English political thought. Edwin's conversion to Christianity came only after the dramatic events that had brought him to the throne. Exiled as a young man by Ethelfrith of Bernicia, Edwin had spent years at the courts of various kings, learning statecraft and building the alliances that would eventually restore him to power. His marriage to Ethelburh of Kent brought Christian influences into the Northumbrian court, while his victory over the Welsh at Chester in 616 demonstrated the divine favour that his Christian counsellors claimed attended faithful kings. The baptism of Edwin at York in 627, performed by Paulinus in a wooden church hastily constructed for the occasion, marked not just a personal conversion, but a transformation in the nature of Northumbrian kingship. Edwin's subsequent campaigns were presented not as mere conquests, but as crusades to extend Christian civilization into pagan territories. His overlordship of the southern English kingdoms was justified in religious as well as political terms, as the authority of a Christian king over rulers who remained attached to the old gods. Yet Edwin's reign also demonstrated the fragility of kingdoms that depended too heavily on the personal charisma of individual rulers. His death at the Battle of Hatfield Chase in 633, fighting against an alliance of Cadwallon of Gwynedd and Penda of Mercia, plunged Northumbria into chaos and revealed the limitations of early medieval statecraft. The kingdom fragmented, Christianity was temporarily suppressed, and Edwin's heirs fled into exile, leaving the impression that the new faith was as vulnerable as the political arrangements that had supported it. The restoration of Christian rule in Northumbria came through Oswald, Edwin's nephew, whose victory at Heavenfield in 634 was attributed to divine intervention in response to the king's prayers. Oswald had spent his exile among the Celtic Christians of Dalriata and Iona, and his restoration brought Celtic rather than Roman influences to bear on Northumbrian Christianity. His invitation to Aidan to establish a mission at Lindisfarne represented a conscious choice to align Northumbria with the spiritual traditions of the Celtic West, rather than the institutional authority of Canterbury. Oswald's reign from 634 to 642 represented the height of Northumbrian power and the full flowering of the synthesis between Christian faith and warrior culture. His military campaigns extended Northumbrian authority deep into Scotland and Wales, while his support for missionary activity carried Christianity into regions that had never known Roman rule. The king's personal devotion to prayer and fasting, his generosity to the poor, and his accessibility to all his subjects created a model of Christian kingship that inspired admiration even among his enemies. The dramatic end of Oswald's reign at the Battle of Maserfield, where he died fighting against Penda of Mercia in 642, demonstrated both the glory and the tragedy of warrior sainthood. According to later accounts, Oswald's last words were prayers for the souls of his enemies, and his dismembered corpse worked miracles that led to his veneration as a martyr king. His death became a central event in the hagiographical literature of Anglo-Saxon England, proof that Christian virtue could transform even military defeat into spiritual victory. Oswiu, who succeeded his brother as King of Northumbria, faced the challenge of maintaining royal authority in the face of growing Mercian power under Penda. His reign from 642 to 670 was marked by a series of strategic retreats and diplomatic accommodations that preserved Northumbrian independence while acknowledging the reality of Mercian hegemony. The crucial moment came at the Battle of the Winweed in 655, where Oswiu's victory over Penda established his credentials as a warrior, while his subsequent generosity to monasteries demonstrated his commitment to Christian principles. It was Oswiu who convened the Synod of Whitby in 664, making the crucial decision to align Northumbrian Christianity with Roman rather than Celtic practices. This choice, made partly for diplomatic reasons and partly from genuine theological conviction, had profound implications for the future development of English Christianity. By choosing Rome, Oswiu linked England more closely to continental European civilization, while beginning the process that would eventually subordinate the distinctive traditions of Celtic Christianity to Roman institutional authority. The rise of Mercia under Penda and his successors represented a different model of kingship, one that initially remained committed to traditional Germanic religious practices even as neighbouring kingdoms converted to Christianity. Penda's long reign from around 626 to 605 demonstrated that military success and effective governance did not necessarily require Christian conversion, a lesson that complicated contemporary assumptions about the relationship between divine favour and earthly power. Penda's Mercia was organised along more sophisticated lines than any previous Anglo-Saxon kingdom, with a complex hierarchy of sub-kings and ealdormen that allowed centralised control over vast territories while maintaining local autonomy where necessary. The kingdom's wealth, derived from its control of major trade routes and its rich agricultural heartland, supported military forces that dominated the politics of 7th century England. Penda's ability to form coalitions with Celtic rulers against Christian Anglo-Saxon kingdoms demonstrated the continuing importance of political calculation over religious affinity in determining royal policies. The conversion of Mercia under Penda's son Wulfhere marked the beginning of a new phase in the kingdom's development, as Christian institutions provided additional mechanisms for royal control while opening new diplomatic possibilities. Mercian monasteries, founded with royal patronage and staffed by continental scholars, became centres of learning that attracted students from across Europe. The kingdom's administrative system, already sophisticated under Penda, became even more efficient as Christian clerics provided literacy and record-keeping skills that enhanced royal authority. The greatest of the Mercian kings was Offa, whose reign from 757 to 796 represented the climax of 8th century English political development. Offa's authority extended over virtually all of England south of the Humber, making him the first ruler since Roman times to govern a territory that approximated the boundaries of modern England. His correspondence with Charlemagne, preserved in continental archives, reveals a ruler who considered himself the equal of the greatest monarchs of his age. Offa's most enduring monument, the great earthwork known as Offa's Dyke that still marks the boundary between England and Wales, represents both a military achievement and a statement of royal ambition unprecedented in post-Roman Britain. The dyke, stretching more than 80 miles from the Severn to the Dee, required the coordinated labour of thousands of workers over several years and demonstrated Offa's ability to mobilise resources on a scale that anticipated later medieval royal projects. The inclusion of royal women in this narrative of warriors and saints reveals another crucial dimension of Anglo-Saxon political development. Hild of Whitby, abbess of the monastery where the Synod of Whitby was held, wielded authority that extended far beyond her religious community to encompass political influence over kings and nobles throughout northern England. Her monastery educated 5 future bishops and preserved traditions of learning that influenced the development of English scholarship for generations. Even more remarkable was Ethelflaed, daughter of Alfred the Great and ruler of Mercia during the early 10th century. Known as the Lady of the Mercians, Ethelflaed proved that the warrior ethos could transcend gender boundaries when political necessity demanded. Her systematic reconquest of Danish-held territories in the Midlands, her construction of fortified towns throughout her realm, and her diplomatic relations with Welsh princes and Scottish kings demonstrated leadership abilities that equalled those of any contemporary male ruler. The age of small kings was drawing to a close by the middle of the 8th century, as the logic of political competition pushed toward larger and more centralized forms of government. Yet the achievements of this period, the synthesis of Christian faith with Germanic warrior culture, the development of legal and administrative institutions that would survive for centuries, the creation of artistic and literary traditions that would influence English culture throughout the medieval period, provided the foundation upon which later English greatness would be built. As the 8th century dawned across the misty hills and windswept coastlines of northern England, something extraordinary was stirring in the monasteries and royal halls of Northumbria. What had begun as a Germanic settlement on the edges of the civilized world was transforming into one of Europe's most brilliant centres of learning and artistic achievement. In scriptoriums where candlelight flickered against vellum pages, in stone workshops where chisels rang against sandstone crosses, in schools where Latin verses mingled with vernacular poetry, a renaissance was unfolding that would illuminate not just England, but the entire European continent. The catalyst for this flowering was a man whose influence would stretch far beyond his northern homeland to touch the very heart of the Carolingian Empire. Alcuin of York, born around 735 into a world where literacy was rare and books were treasured beyond gold, would become the bridge between insular English scholarship and continental European learning. His early education at the Cathedral School of York, under the guidance of Archbishop Egbert, immersed him in a curriculum that combined traditional Germanic wisdom with classical learning preserved in monastic libraries since the days of Roman Britain. The school at York had become, by Alcuin's time, one of the great intellectual centres of medieval Europe. Its library, assembled over generations of careful acquisition and copying, contained works that had disappeared from most continental collections during the turbulent centuries following Rome's collapse. Here students could read Virgil and Cicero, Jerome and Augustine, Bede and Aldhelm, all within walls that echoed daily with the chanting of psalms and the scratching of quills on parchment. Alcuin's genius lay not merely in his mastery of this accumulated learning, but in his ability to synthesize and transmit it. His textbooks on grammar, rhetoric and dialectic became standard works throughout medieval Europe, while his biblical commentaries influenced theological thinking for centuries. When Charlemagne encountered this Northumbrian scholar at Parma in 781 and invited him to organize education throughout the Frankish Empire, he was recognizing not just individual brilliance, but the superior quality of English scholarship that Alcuin represented. The invitation to Aachen marked the beginning of Alcuin's most influential years, as he became the architect of the Carolingian educational renaissance that would reshape European intellectual life. His reforms of the palace school, his standardization of script and spelling, his establishment of cathedral schools throughout the Frankish Empire, all drew on methods and traditions developed in the monasteries of Anglo-Saxon England. Through Alcuin, the learning that had been preserved and nurtured in Northumbrian scriptorium spread across the continent to create the foundations of medieval European education. Yet Alcuin's departure for Francia was also symbolic of a broader shift in the balance of European learning. The very success of English scholarship had attracted continental attention and patronage that drained the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of some of their most brilliant minds. The brain drain that began in Alcuin's generation would continue throughout the 8th and 9th centuries, as ambitious scholars found greater opportunities and richer rewards in the courts of the Frankish emperors than in the increasingly troubled kingdoms of their birth. The manuscripts produced in Northumbrian scriptoriums during this golden age represent perhaps the highest achievement of medieval book art, works that combined technical perfection with artistic vision to create objects of devotion that were also masterpieces of human creativity. The Codex Amiatinus, created at Wearmouth Jarrow around 716, stands as the largest and most ambitious manuscript project undertaken anywhere in medieval Europe. This complete Bible, written on vellum from the hides of over 1,500 calves, represents not just scholarly dedication, but also the enormous economic resources that Northumbrian monasteries could command at the height of their prosperity. The creation of the Codex Amiatinus required the coordination of multiple scriptoriums over several years, with teams of scribes working simultaneously on different sections, while artists prepared the illuminated pages that would bind the work together into a unified whole. The text itself was based on the most accurate biblical manuscripts available, with careful attention to textual variants and scholarly annotations that made it a masterpiece of contemporary biblical scholarship, as well as artistic achievement. The Lindisfarne Gospels, created around 715 by the monk Edfrith, represent a different but equally remarkable achievement, the fusion of Celtic decorative traditions with Germanic artistic motifs and Mediterranean iconographic programs to create a visual language that was uniquely English. Every page of this manuscript is a meditation on the relationship between divine truth and human creativity, with carpet pages that transform Christian crosses into intricate geometric patterns that seem to pulse with spiritual energy. The artistic synthesis achieved in the Lindisfarne Gospels reflects the broader cultural fusion that characterized 8th century Northumbria. Celtic interlaced patterns borrowed from Irish manuscripts mingle with Germanic animal ornament derived from metalwork traditions, while the overall iconographic program draws on continental models that had been adapted to insular tastes. This was not mere eclecticism, but a conscious effort to create a visual vocabulary that could speak simultaneously to Celtic, Germanic and Mediterranean traditions. The Ruthwell Cross, carved sometime in the early 8th century and standing today as one of the supreme achievements of Anglo-Saxon sculpture, demonstrates how this artistic synthesis extended beyond manuscript illumination to encompass public monuments that served both devotional and educational purposes. The cross combines runic inscriptions in Old English with Latin texts and sophisticated sculptural programs that tell the story of Christ's passion with a power that transcends linguistic barriers. The runic verses carved on the Ruthwell Cross include portions of the Dream of the Rood, one of the greatest poems in Old English literature, transformed from oral performance into permanent stone monument. This transformation reveals the sophisticated understanding of the relationship between different media that characterized Northumbrian artistic culture. The same religious themes that appeared in illuminated manuscripts could be expressed through stone carving, metalwork, or oral poetry, creating a multimedia environment that reinforced Christian teaching through multiple sensory channels. The centres of scholarship that flourished throughout Northumbria during this period rivaled anything available on the European continent. Wearmouth Jarrow, under the patronage of Benedict Biscop and later Ceolfrith, assembled a library that contained the largest collection of books north of the Alps. Hexham, under Bishop Wilfrid and his successors, became a centre for legal studies that influenced the development of canon law throughout northwestern Europe. York, with its cathedral school and impressive library, trained scholars who would carry English learning to courts and monasteries across the continent. While Northumbrian culture reached heights of artistic and intellectual achievement that dazzled contemporary Europe, the political future of England was being shaped in the chalk downs and river valleys of the south, where the kingdom of Wessex was undergoing a transformation that would make it the crucible of English unity. The rise of West Saxon power during the late 8th and early 9th centuries represents more than a simple shift in the balance of military strength. It was the beginning of a political revolution that would create the institutional foundations of medieval English government. The architect of this transformation was Egbert, whose reign from 802 to 839 established Wessex as the dominant power in southern England and created the precedents that his grandson Alfred would later use to forge a unified English kingdom. Egbert's path to the throne reveals the complex international connections that shaped Anglo-Saxon politics during this period. Exiled from Wessex during his youth, he had spent years at the court of Charlemagne, where he observed first-hand the administrative methods that had enabled the Frankish Empire to govern territories stretching from the Pyrenees to the Danube. This continental experience proved invaluable when Egbert finally gained the West Saxon throne in 802. His systematic campaigns against the Mercians drew on strategic concepts learned in Frankish service, while his administrative reforms reflected continental influences adapted to Anglo-Saxon conditions. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Ellendun in 825, where Egbert's victory over Bornwulf of Mercia effectively ended the Mercian supremacy that had dominated English politics for over a century. The consequences of Ellendun extended far beyond the immediate military result. Egbert's subsequent campaign into Kent, his acceptance of submission from the East Anglians, and his conquest of the Mercian dependencies in Essex and Sussex created a new political configuration that placed Wessex at the centre of English affairs for the first time since the 7th century. More importantly, these victories demonstrated that effective kingship now required institutional as well as military capabilities, as the administration of diverse territories demanded bureaucratic skills that purely warrior kings could not provide. The development of royal administration under Egbert and his successors represents one of the most significant innovations in Anglo-Saxon political history. Drawing on both continental models and indigenous traditions, West Saxon administrators created a system of local government that combined efficiency with flexibility, central control with regional autonomy. The shire system that emerged during this period would survive virtually unchanged until the Norman conquest, and in modified form far beyond it. Each shire was governed by an ealdorman appointed by the king but drawn from the local aristocracy, creating an administrative structure that balanced royal authority with regional interests. Below the ealdormen were the reeves, royal officials responsible for specific administrative functions, ranging from tax collection to judicial oversight. This hierarchical system allowed royal authority to penetrate into local communities, while preserving the traditional structures of kinship and neighbourhood that governed daily life. The Witan, the council of wise men who advised the king on major decisions, evolved during this period from an informal gathering of royal companions into a sophisticated deliberative body that played a crucial role in West Saxon governance. Unlike the continental assemblies of the same period, which were dominated by great nobles and high clergy, the Anglo-Saxon Witan included representatives of the free peasantry, whose counsel was sought on matters ranging from taxation to military service. The meetings of the Witan reveal a conception of royal authority that was both more limited and more effective than the autocratic models developing on the continent. Anglo-Saxon kings ruled by consent as well as by conquest, and their authority depended on their ability to maintain the support of the free population through consultative governance, rather than bureaucratic coercion. This tradition of consultation would prove crucial to England's later political development, providing the constitutional precedents that would eventually evolve into parliamentary government. The legal innovations of this period represent perhaps the most enduring aspect of West Saxon political development. Building on the foundation established by Ethelbert of Kent and other early lawmakers, West Saxon legal scholars created a comprehensive system of written law that combined Germanic customary traditions with Christian moral principles and Roman jurisprudential concepts. This legal synthesis would provide the foundation for English common law, influencing legal development not just in medieval England but throughout the English-speaking world. The West Saxon law codes reveal a society in which royal authority was balanced by deeply rooted traditions of individual rights and community self-governance. The concept of due process, the right to trial by one's peers, the principle that even kings were subject to law, all these fundamental elements of later English legal tradition can be traced to developments during this formative period of West Saxon political evolution. The cultural flowering that transformed 8th and 9th century England extended far beyond the scriptoriums and royal courts to encompass every aspect of daily life, creating an artistic and literary renaissance that reflected the growing confidence and sophistication of Anglo-Saxon civilization. In the great halls of kings and thanes, in the workshops of craftsmen and the fields of farmers, in the monasteries where monks copied manuscripts and the villages where storytellers entertained peasant audiences, a distinctly English culture was emerging that would influence world literature and art for centuries to come. The supreme literary achievement of this period was Beowulf, the great epic that stands as the earliest masterpiece of English poetry. Composed sometime during the 8th century, probably in the Kingdom of Mercia, this 382-line poem represents the culmination of centuries of oral tradition, transformed by Christian learning into a work of unprecedented sophistication and power. The poet who created Beowulf was no simple entertainer, but a literary artist of the highest caliber, someone who understood both the heroic traditions of his Germanic ancestors and the theological complexities of his Christian faith. The world of Beowulf is simultaneously familiar and strange, a Germanic society of kings and warriors, but one viewed through the lens of Christian moral philosophy. The hero's battles against monsters become allegories of the eternal struggle between good and evil, while the poem's elegiac tone reflects a Christian understanding of the transience of earthly glory. Yet the poem never abandons its celebration of heroic valour, creating a synthesis between warrior culture and Christian ethics that mirrors the broader cultural transformation of Anglo-Saxon England. The language of Beowulf reveals the remarkable literary sophistication that Old English had achieved by the 8th century. The poem's vocabulary draws on multiple linguistic registers, from the elevated diction of courtly praise to the intimate language of personal relationships, while its complex system of kennings metaphorical compounds that replace simple nouns creates a poetic texture of extraordinary richness. The phrase "well rowed for sea," "sky candle for sun," "battle light for sword" all demonstrate how Anglo-Saxon poets could transform the ordinary world into something luminous and strange through the alchemy of poetic language. The manuscript tradition that preserved Beowulf also gives us the Exeter Book, a collection of shorter poems that reveals the full range of Anglo-Saxon literary achievement. The riddles contained in this manuscript demonstrate a playful intellectual sophistication that delighted in wordplay and double meanings, while exploring serious philosophical questions about the nature of existence. I'm a lonely being, wounded by weapons of war, scarred by swords. Often I see battle, fierce conflict, yet I hold no hope of help or support before I perish among warriors. The weapons of fighters strike me, the work of smiths bites me, hard-edged and sharp. Always I must await a more fearsome encounter. Never can I find among city dwellers a physician who might heal my wounds with herbs and roots. The answer, a sword, reveals how Anglo-Saxon poets could transform even instruments of warfare into vehicles for meditation on mortality and suffering. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, begun during Alfred's reign but incorporating earlier materials, represents another remarkable literary innovation, the creation of a continuous historical narrative in the vernacular language. Unlike continental chronicles, which were typically written in Latin and focused primarily on ecclesiastical affairs, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle attempted to record the complete history of the English people in their own language, creating a sense of national identity that transcended the boundaries of individual kingdoms. The Chronicle's annual entries, with their terse but evocative style, capture the rhythm of medieval life in all its variety. In this year, King Ethelbald was killed at Seckington by his own retainers at night, and his body lies at Repton, and Bjornred succeeded to the kingdom and held it a little while and unhappily. Such entries, repeated year after year, create a cumulative impression of a world where violence and piety, prosperity and disaster, success and failure followed one another with bewildering rapidity. The material culture of Anglo-Saxon England during this period reveals a society of remarkable artistic sophistication, where even functional objects were transformed into works of art through the skill of craftsmen who understood that beauty was not a luxury, but a necessity of civilized life. The jewellery found in burial sites and hoards demonstrates metalworking techniques that rivaled anything produced in contemporary Europe, while the everyday objects recovered by archaeologists reveal the high standard of living achieved by all social classes. The Staffordshire hoard, discovered in 2009 and dating to the 7th or 8th century, contains over 3,500 items of gold and silver that represent the largest collection of Anglo-Saxon metalwork ever found. The craftsmanship displayed in these objects, sword hilts decorated with cloisonné garnets, gold belt buckles carved with intricate interlace patterns, silver bowls embossed with sophisticated figural scenes, demonstrates the technical mastery and artistic vision of Anglo-Saxon goldsmiths and silversmiths. Domestic architecture during this period evolved from the simple timber halls of earlier centuries to more complex structures that reflected growing prosperity and social sophistication. Archaeological excavations have revealed buildings with specialized functions, separate halls for eating and sleeping, workshops for different crafts, storage buildings for surplus agricultural production, all arranged around courtyards that provided security and privacy for extended families. The great stone churches that began to appear throughout England during this period represent perhaps the most visible manifestation of the cultural transformation taking place. Churches like All Saints at Brixworth, St Lawrence at Bradford-on-Avon, and St Andrew at Greenstead demonstrate how Anglo-Saxon builders adapted continental architectural models to local conditions and traditions, creating a distinctly English ecclesiastical architecture that would influence church building for centuries. The economic transformation that accompanied the cultural flowering of 8th and 9th century England created new patterns of trade and urbanization that connected the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms more closely than ever before to the wider European economy. The revival of commercial life centered on emerging towns and supported by improved coinage systems provided the material foundation for the artistic and literary achievements that made this period a golden age of Anglo-Saxon civilization. London's emergence as the dominant commercial centre of southern England represents one of the most significant economic developments of this period. The old Roman city of Londinium had largely been abandoned during the 5th and 6th centuries, but a new settlement called Londonwick had grown up to the west, along the banks of the Thames between what are now the Strand and Fleet Street. This new London became the hub of a trading network that stretched from the Baltic to the Mediterranean, bringing together merchants from across the known world in markets that bustled with activity throughout the year. The archaeological evidence for London's commercial importance during this period is overwhelming. Excavations in the Covent Garden area have revealed workshops where craftsmen produced goods for export, warehouses where imported materials were stored before distribution throughout England, and residential areas where foreign merchants established permanent communities. The pottery found in these excavations includes pieces from the Rhineland, northern France, and even the eastern Mediterranean, demonstrating the truly international character of London's trade connections. The revival of commercial activity was supported by developments in coinage that provided a stable medium of exchange for increasingly complex transactions. The silver penny, introduced during the 8th century and standardized under Offa of Mercia, became the foundation of English monetary system that would endure until the 13th century. These coins, minted in multiple locations throughout England but conforming to standard weights and silver content, facilitated trade both within the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and with continental partners. Offa's coins reveal the sophistication of Anglo-Saxon monetary policy during this period. Some bore inscriptions identifying the money and mint, providing quality control and preventing counterfeiting. Others carried royal portraits that rivaled contemporary Carolingian and Byzantine examples in their artistic quality. Most remarkably, some of Offa's coins bore Arabic inscriptions, apparently copied from Islamic dinars, demonstrating the global reach of 8th century European trade networks. The development of specialized craft production during this period created new forms of economic organization that supported growing populations and more complex social structures. Archaeological evidence reveals workshops dedicated to specific crafts: metalworking, textile production, leatherworking, pottery manufacture, all organized on scales that suggest production for regional and international markets rather than merely local consumption. The textile industry provides a particularly clear example of this economic transformation. Anglo-Saxon England became famous throughout Europe for the quality of its woolen cloth, with English wool and finished textiles finding markets from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean. The development of this industry required not just skilled craftsmen, but also new forms of economic organization that could coordinate the activities of shepherds, spinners, weavers, dyers, and merchants across multiple regions and kingdoms. Urban development during this period extended beyond London to include the growth of trading centres throughout England. York, Canterbury, Winchester and other towns developed specialised commercial quarters where merchants and craftsmen congregated, creating the economic diversity that supported cultural and political development. These early medieval towns were still small by modern standards, but they represented a fundamental shift from the purely agricultural economy of earlier centuries toward the more diversified commercial economy that would characterize later medieval England. The rise of fortified towns or burhs during the late 8th and early 9th centuries created a new form of urban settlement that combined commercial and military functions. These planned communities, many of which would later become major English cities, were laid out according to regular street patterns that facilitated both defence and trade. The burh system represented a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between military security and economic prosperity that would influence English urban development for centuries. Continental connections during this period extended beyond simple trade relationships to encompass diplomatic, cultural and ecclesiastical exchanges that made Anglo-Saxon England an integral part of European civilization. The correspondence between English kings and the Carolingian emperors reveals political relationships based on mutual respect and shared interests, while the movement of scholars, artists, and craftsmen created cultural exchanges that enriched both English and continental traditions. The importation of luxury goods, wine from the Rhine Valley, silk from Byzantium, spices from the eastern Mediterranean created new standards of aristocratic consumption that influenced social development throughout Anglo-Saxon England. These imports were balanced by English exports of high-quality manufactured goods, particularly metalwork and textiles, that were prized throughout Europe for their artistic excellence and technical sophistication. The economic prosperity of this period provided the material foundation for the cultural achievements that made 8th and 9th century England one of the brightest lights of European civilization. The surplus wealth generated by expanded trade and improved agricultural productivity supported the monasteries where manuscripts were copied and illuminated, the royal courts where poets composed their verses, and the workshops where craftsmen created objects of enduring beauty. Without this economic transformation, the golden flowering of Anglo-Saxon culture would have been impossible, demonstrating once again the intimate connection between material prosperity and spiritual achievement that characterized the greatest periods of human civilization. The golden morning of June 8th, 793, dawned like countless others over the tidal island of Lindisfarne, where the gentle lapping of North Sea waves against rocky shores had for generations provided a peaceful soundtrack to the prayers and scholarship of Celtic monks. In the scriptorium, brothers bent over vellum pages, their quills scratching Latin verses onto parchment that would preserve divine wisdom for future generations. The great cross of St. Cuthbert stood sentinel over this holy place, its carved stone surfaces telling the story of Christ's passion to pilgrims who came seeking blessing and learning. Nothing in the morning mist suggested that this day would mark the beginning of the end for the golden age of Northumbrian Christianity. Then, cutting through the grey waters like harbingers of apocalypse, came shapes that would haunt English nightmares for centuries, the curved prows of longships, their dragon heads rising and falling with each stroke of ashwood oars. These were not the familiar trading vessels that occasionally visited the monastery's harbour, bringing wine from Francia or silver from the Rhine. These ships carried warriors whose very presence seemed to darken the sky, men whose braided hair and glinting mail spoke of violence and conquest, whose foreign voices called upon gods whose names were thunder and war. The monks who first glimpsed these approaching vessels could not have comprehended the magnitude of what was beginning. They saw only strange ships and foreign men, perhaps traders from the northern lands who had lost their way, or merchants seeking the monastery's famous hospitality. The administrative routine continued. Brother Higbald, perhaps, moving to greet these unexpected visitors with the courtesy that Lindisfarne had always shown to strangers. The sacred vessels remained unguarded on the altar. The treasury doors stood unlocked. The community gathered for the day's second prayers, unaware that their world was about to shatter. What followed defied every assumption about the sanctity of holy ground that had governed European civilization since Constantine's conversion. The Vikings, for that is what history would call these sea-wolves, moved through the monastery like a force of nature, their axes and swords making no distinction between sacred and secular, between priest and peasant. The silver chalices that had held the blood of Christ were seized for their metal value. The golden book covers that protected illuminated gospels were stripped away for their precious materials. The very altar stones were stained with blood that no amount of prayer could cleanse. Alcuin of York, safe in the court of Charlemagne at Aachen, captured the shock that reverberated through Christian Europe when news of Lindisfarne's fate reached the continent. Lo, it is nearly 350 years that we and our fathers have inhabited this most lovely land, and never before has such a terror appeared as we have now suffered from a pagan race. Nor was it thought that such an inroad from the sea could be made. These words, written by the greatest scholar of his age, reveal the profound psychological impact of the Viking raids. They had shattered fundamental assumptions about divine protection and Christian sanctuary that had shaped medieval consciousness. The attack on Lindisfarne was not an isolated incident, but the beginning of a carefully orchestrated campaign of terror that would transform the political and cultural landscape of the British Isles. The following year, 794, saw the sacking of Jarrow, where Bede the Venerable had written his great history of the English people. In 795, the ancient monastery of Iona, the spiritual heart of Celtic Christianity, felt the bite of Viking steel. Each raid followed the same pattern-swift approach by sea, overwhelming violence, systematic plundering, and swift departure before any organized resistance could be mounted. These early raids revealed the sophisticated intelligence network that supported Viking operations. The attackers knew exactly when monasteries would be most vulnerable, which communities held the greatest treasures, how local defense systems were organized, and where resistance was likely to be weakest. This was not random piracy, but systematic warfare conducted with the precision of a military campaign and the strategic vision of a conquest. The escalation from sporadic raids to sustained military campaigns occurred gradually over the middle decades of the 9th century, as individual Viking warbands began to coordinate their efforts and establish permanent bases from which to launch ever more ambitious operations. Winter camps appeared along the English coasts, fortified enclosures where Viking armies could rest and plan between campaigns. These camps became the nuclei around which larger settlements would eventually develop, marking the transition from raiding to permanent occupation. The Great Watershed came in 865 with the arrival of what the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle calls the Great Army, a confederation of Danish warbands under the leadership of legendary figures whose names would echo through English history like thunderclaps. Ivar the Boneless, whose nickname may have referred to his serpentine cunning rather than any physical disability, emerged as the strategic mastermind of this invasion. His brothers Halfdan and Hubba brought their own warrior followings, while other leaders like Guthrum commanded independent forces that operated within the larger confederation. This was no longer raiding but conquest, a systematic campaign to carve new kingdoms from English soil, to replace Christian Anglo-Saxon rulers with pagan Danish jarls, to transform the very character of English civilization. The great army landed in East Anglia, where they established their first permanent base, and began the methodical destruction of the English kingdoms that would continue for more than a decade. The fall of York in 866 demonstrated both the military effectiveness of Viking tactics and the political weakness of the divided English kingdoms. The ancient Roman city, which had served as the northern capital of English Christianity and learning, fell to the Vikings after a siege that revealed the inadequacy of Anglo-Saxon defensive systems. King Ella of Northumbria, who had killed the legendary Viking leader Ragnar Lodbrok according to later sagas, met his own death in the ruins of his capital, allegedly executed by the Blood Eagle ritual that represented the ultimate Viking expression of vengeance. East Anglia, the wealthy kingdom whose trade connections had made it one of the most prosperous regions of England, fell next to the Viking advance. King Edmund, who would later be venerated as a martyr saint, died defending his realm against an enemy that recognized no distinction between sacred and secular authority. The systematic destruction of East Anglian monasteries and churches marked the end of a golden age of scholarship and artistic achievement that had rivaled anything in contemporary Europe. The establishment of the Danelaw represented more than mere military conquest. It was the creation of an alternative civilization within the heart of England, a Scandinavian society with its own laws, customs and political structures. The boundaries of this new realm roughly followed the old Roman road system, with Danish authority extending north and east of Watling Street, while English power remained concentrated in the western and southern regions. Within the Danelaw, Viking settlers established new forms of social organisation based on Scandinavian legal traditions that emphasised individual rights and local autonomy, rather than the hierarchical feudal relationships that characterised Anglo-Saxon society. The impact of Viking settlement extended far beyond political control, to encompass fundamental changes in language, law and social structure that would influence English development for centuries. Place names ending in by, Thorpe and Thwaite marked areas of dense Scandinavian settlement, while personal names of Norse origin became common throughout the former English territories. The legal systems that developed in the Danelaw incorporated Scandinavian concepts of justice and social organisation that would eventually influence the development of English common law. In the dark winter of 878, when Viking victory seemed inevitable, and the last English kingdom teetered on the edge of extinction, a king fled through the Somerset marshes, carrying nothing but his sword, his faith, and an unshakable determination to preserve what remained of Anglo-Saxon civilization. Alfred of Wessex, barely 30 years old and reigning for less than a decade, had watched his kingdom crumble before the relentless advance of Guthrum's Viking army. Yet in those frozen marshlands around Athelney, where mist rose from dark waters and ravens called from skeletal trees, the future of England would be forged through a combination of strategic brilliance, military innovation, and sheer indomitable will. The disasters that had driven Alfred to this desperate refuge began on Twelfth Night, 878, when Guthrum launched a surprise winter campaign that caught the West Saxon army scattered in their homes, celebrating the Christmas season in the traditional Germanic fashion. The Viking assault was swift and devastating. Fortified towns that had never known siege fell within days, the royal administration collapsed, and much of the West Saxon nobility either fled the kingdom or submitted to Danish authority. Only Alfred and a handful of loyal companions escaped the general catastrophe, making their way through snow-covered forests and frozen fens to the temporary safety of the Somerset marshes. The month that followed tested every aspect of Alfred's character and abilities, transforming a conventional warrior king into the strategic genius who would save England from complete subjugation. Living as an outlaw in his own kingdom, Alfred learned lessons that no amount of courtly education could have provided. He discovered how common farmers felt about their Viking conquerors, how local resistance networks operated, which thanes remained loyal despite overwhelming pressure to submit, and how the geography of his kingdom could be used to support guerrilla warfare rather than conventional battles. The legend of Alfred burning the cakes, whether historically accurate or not, captures something essential about this transformative period in his reign. The image of a king so preoccupied with planning the liberation of his kingdom that he neglects humble domestic duties reflects the intense mental focus that Alfred brought to the strategic challenges facing him. During those winter months in the marshes, he was not merely surviving, but planning, analysing Viking tactics, considering new approaches to military organisation, and developing the comprehensive strategy that would drive the invaders from Wessex. The secret assembly of the West Saxon Fyrd in the spring of 878 represents one of the most remarkable achievements in medieval military organisation. Despite months of Viking occupation, despite the apparent collapse of royal authority, despite the submission of many leading nobles, Alfred managed to coordinate a general mobilisation that brought together fighting men from across Wessex for a final decisive confrontation with Guthrum's forces. This achievement required not just personal charisma, but sophisticated understanding of how Anglo-Saxon military organisation actually functioned at the local level. The Battle of Edington, fought in May 878 on the chalk downs of Wiltshire, was one of those rare historical moments when the fate of an entire civilization hung in the balance. Alfred's victory was not merely military but psychological. It demonstrated that Viking armies could be defeated in pitched battle, that Christian kings could prevail over pagan conquerors, that the apparent destiny of Scandinavian dominance over England was not inevitable. The psychological impact extended beyond Wessex to inspire resistance movements throughout the occupied territories. The treaty negotiated with Guthrum after Edington reveals Alfred's strategic vision, extending far beyond immediate military victory to encompass long-term coexistence between English and Danish populations. Rather than attempting to expel all Vikings from English soil, a task that would have been impossible given the limited resources available to him, Alfred recognized that partition and peaceful coexistence offered the best hope for preserving Anglo-Saxon civilization while acknowledging political realities. The boundary established by the treaty roughly followed the old Roman roads, creating a clear division between English and Danish spheres of influence, while providing mechanisms for trade and diplomatic contact. Guthrum's conversion to Christianity, with Alfred standing as his godfather, represented more than mere political expedience. It was a symbolic transformation that offered the possibility of cultural synthesis rather than perpetual conflict. The baptismal ceremony, conducted with all the pageantry that Anglo-Saxon kingship could muster, demonstrated Alfred's understanding that lasting peace required more than military agreements. By incorporating the Danish leader into the Christian community, Alfred was creating the foundation for future integration of Viking settlers into English society. The military innovations that Alfred developed during the crisis of 878 and refined over the following decades created the institutional foundation upon which his successors would build the reconquest of England. The reformed Fyrd system divided military obligation into rotating units that could maintain continuous readiness while allowing agricultural work to continue. This innovation solved one of the fundamental problems of early medieval warfare, the difficulty of maintaining armies in the field for extended periods without destroying the agricultural foundation of the kingdom's economy. The burh system, perhaps Alfred's most important military innovation, created a network of fortified towns that could serve as refuges for local populations while providing secure bases for military operations. Each burh was strategically located to command important river crossings, road junctions or natural defensive positions, and was garrisoned by local forces that could respond quickly to Viking raids while summoning support from neighbouring fortifications. This system effectively neutralised the Viking advantage in mobility by ensuring that no major target was more than a day's march from a fortified stronghold. The development of an English navy capable of challenging Viking supremacy at sea represented perhaps Alfred's most visionary achievement. Recognizing that control of the seas was essential to preventing future Viking invasions, Alfred commissioned the construction of warships designed specifically to match the capabilities of Viking longships. These vessels, built to carry 60 oars and crewed by experienced sailors, could intercept Viking fleets before they reached the English coast, or pursue retreating raiders to their bases in Ireland or Francia. The transformation of Alfred from successful war leader into scholar king and lawgiver reveals the full scope of his vision for English recovery and renewal. Where other medieval rulers might have been content with military victory and political stability, Alfred understood that lasting security required cultural and intellectual revival that could compete with the sophisticated civilization of his Viking opponents. His educational program, legal reforms, and cultural initiatives created the foundation upon which later English achievements would build, establishing traditions of learning and governance that would influence English development for centuries. The educational crisis that Alfred addressed was more profound than simple illiteracy. It represented the near-complete breakdown of the Latin learning that had made Anglo-Saxon England one of the intellectual centres of early medieval Europe. The Viking raids had destroyed most of the monastic libraries where classical and patristic texts had been preserved, while the disruption of normal educational patterns had created a generation of nobles and clergy who could barely read their own vernacular language, much less the Latin that was essential for serious scholarship. Alfred's response to this crisis was characteristically systematic and ambitious. Rather than attempting to restore the old educational system based on monastic schools and Latin literacy, he pioneered a revolutionary approach that made vernacular learning the foundation of a new intellectual culture. His program of translating essential Latin texts into Old English created a body of vernacular literature that could serve the educational needs of a society that no longer possessed widespread Latin competence, while preserving the essential content of classical and Christian learning. The translations that Alfred personally supervised or contributed to reveal both his scholarly ambitions and his practical political concerns. Roscius's history against the pagans provided a Christian interpretation of world history that could help his subjects understand the Viking invasions within the context of divine providence. Gregory's pastoral care offered guidance for clergy and administrators struggling to maintain Christian civilization under difficult circumstances. Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy explored questions of divine justice and human suffering that were particularly relevant to a generation that had witnessed the apparent triumph of pagan violence over Christian virtue. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which Alfred commissioned and which began systematic compilation during his reign, represents one of the most important innovations in medieval historical writing. Unlike continental chronicles, which were typically written in Latin by ecclesiastical authors for ecclesiastical audiences, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was composed in the vernacular language and designed to create a sense of English national identity that transcended the boundaries of individual kingdoms. The Chronicle's annual entries, distributed to monasteries throughout England and updated locally, created a shared historical narrative that reinforced the unity of English-speaking peoples against their Danish neighbours. Alfred's legal reforms addressed one of the most fundamental challenges facing any medieval ruler: how to create consistent standards of justice in a society characterized by diverse local customs and competing legal traditions. The law code that bears his name represents a masterful synthesis of Mercian, West Saxon, and Kentish legal traditions, combined with Christian moral principles and practical solutions to contemporary problems. The code's emphasis on protecting the weak against the strong, on providing legal remedies for social conflicts, and on limiting the scope of blood feud reflected Alfred's understanding that lasting peace required more than military victory. The cultural preservation that Alfred achieved through his educational and legal programs was perhaps his greatest contribution to English history. By creating mechanisms for transmitting Anglo-Saxon traditions through periods of political disruption, by establishing institutional frameworks that could survive individual royal deaths, by developing vernacular alternatives to Latin learning, Alfred ensured that English civilization would not simply disappear under the pressure of Scandinavian settlement. His vision of cultural synthesis rather than cultural replacement provided the foundation for the remarkable flowering of Anglo-Saxon achievement that would characterize the 10th century. The administrative innovations that Alfred developed to govern a kingdom under constant military pressure created precedents that would influence English governmental development throughout the medieval period. The system of royal officials responsible for specific administrative functions, the regular assemblies that brought together representatives from different social classes, the written records that preserved legal precedents and administrative decisions, all represented advances in governmental sophistication that placed Alfred's Wessex at the forefront of contemporary European political development. The systematic reconquest of Danish England that began after Alfred's death in 899 owed as much to the strategic brilliance of his daughter Ethelflaed as to the military prowess of his son Edward the Elder. The Lady of the Mercians, as contemporary sources called her, proved that the warrior tradition that had shaped Anglo-Saxon kingship could transcend gender boundaries when political necessity demanded exceptional leadership. Her campaigns in the Midlands, conducted in careful coordination with her brother's operations in the south and east, demonstrated military and political skills that equaled those of any contemporary male ruler. Ethelflaed's rise to independent authority in Mercia reflects the complex political arrangements that Alfred had negotiated to secure Wessex's northern frontier. Her marriage to Ethelred of Mercia had sealed an alliance between the two surviving English kingdoms, while her position as Alfred's daughter had given her access to West Saxon military resources and strategic knowledge. When Ethelred's illness transferred effective power to his wife, Ethelflaed found herself responsible for defending and governing a realm that faced constant pressure from Danish armies based in the 5 boroughs of the northern Midlands. The military strategy that Ethelflaed developed for the reconquest of Danish Mercia built upon the defensive innovations that her father had pioneered, while adapting them to the specific challenges of offensive warfare. Her systematic construction of fortified towns throughout her territories created secure bases from which her forces could launch attacks against Danish strongholds, while providing refuges for local populations during enemy counterattacks. The careful positioning of these burhs along river valleys and ancient roadways demonstrated sophisticated understanding of military logistics and strategic geography. The fortress-building program that made Ethelflaed famous throughout early medieval Europe represented more than military engineering. It was a comprehensive strategy for territorial control that integrated military, political and economic considerations. Each new burh served as a market centre where English and Danish merchants could trade under royal protection, administrative headquarters where royal officials could collect taxes and dispense justice, and a symbol of restored English authority that encouraged local resistance to Danish rule. The reconquest of Derby in 917 marked the crucial turning point in Ethelflaed's campaign to recover the Danish territories. This fortified town, one of the 5 boroughs that had served as centres of Danish power in the Midlands, had been considered impregnable by previous English commanders. Ethelflaed's successful siege demonstrated the effectiveness of her military innovations, while providing psychological proof that Danish dominance could be reversed through sustained English effort. The submission of Leicester following Derby's fall revealed the broader political implications of Ethelflaed's military success. The Danish jarls who had ruled these territories for generations recognised that continued resistance was futile in the face of coordinated English pressure from both south and west. Their acceptance of English overlordship, negotiated through treaties that preserved their personal properties while acknowledging Ethelflaed's political authority, demonstrated her skill as a diplomat as well as a military commander. The partnership between Ethelflaed and Edward the Elder represents one of the most successful examples of coordinated military strategy in medieval European history. Their campaigns, carefully synchronized to prevent Danish forces from concentrating against either English advance, systematically isolated and reduced Danish strongholds throughout the Midlands and East Anglia. The brother-sister cooperation that made this strategy possible reflected not just family loyalty, but shared commitment to their father's vision of English unity. The death of Ethelflaed at Tamworth in 918, just as her greatest victories were consolidating English control over the central Midlands, deprived England of one of its most capable rulers at a crucial moment in the Reconquest. The mourning that her death occasioned among both English and Danish populations testified to the respect that her leadership had earned across ethnic and political boundaries. Her funeral at Gloucester, attended by representatives of every major political community in Britain, demonstrated the historical significance that contemporaries attributed to her achievements. The legacy that Aethelflaed left to English political development extends far beyond her military conquests to encompass precedents for female rule that would influence later medieval governance. Her exercise of independent royal authority, her command of armies in the field, her negotiation of international treaties, all established that gender was not necessarily a barrier to effective political leadership in Anglo-Saxon society. These precedents would prove crucial to the later acceptance of female sovereignty in English political tradition. The completion of England's unification under Edward the Elder between 918 and 924 represented the culmination of a strategic vision that had begun with Alfred's defensive innovations and been refined through Aethelflaed's offensive campaigns. Edward's systematic reduction of the remaining Danish strongholds, his integration of conquered territories into a unified administrative system, and his establishment of effective sovereignty over the Celtic kingdoms of Wales and Scotland created the foundation upon which his son Athelstan would build the first truly unified English monarchy. The final phase of the Danish reconquest required different strategies from those that had succeeded in the Midlands, as the remaining Viking strongholds were concentrated in regions where Danish settlement was densest, and local support for English rule was weakest. The northern territories around York in particular had developed a distinct Anglo-Scandinavian culture that combined Norse political traditions with Christian religious practices, creating communities that were neither fully English nor fully Danish, but something unprecedented in European experience. Edward's approach to these final territories demonstrated the political sophistication that characterized his entire reign. Rather than attempting to impose uniform English customs on diverse populations, he developed flexible administrative arrangements that preserved local autonomy, while establishing clear mechanisms for royal authority. The integration of Danish legal traditions into English governmental systems, the incorporation of Scandinavian nobles into English administrative hierarchies, the adaptation of English military organisation to include Danish fighting men, all reflected Edward's understanding that lasting unity required synthesis rather than conquest. The submission of the Scottish King Constantine and the Welsh princes in 920 marked Edward's emergence as the dominant political figure in the British Isles. This acknowledgement of English overlordship by the Celtic kingdoms represented more than diplomatic protocol. It was recognition that the restored English monarchy possessed resources and capabilities that no other British power could match. The ceremony at which these submissions were received, conducted with all the pageantry that Anglo-Saxon kingship could muster, established precedents for royal authority that would influence British political development for centuries. The administrative integration of the conquered territories required innovations in governmental organisation that pushed Anglo-Saxon political development far beyond its traditional boundaries. The shire system that had served adequately for the governance of Wessex needed fundamental modification to accommodate territories with different legal traditions, settlement patterns, and economic structures. Edward's solution involved creating new categories of local officials responsible for specific functions, while preserving traditional assemblies that could adapt royal policies to local conditions. The establishment of a unified English coinage system under Edward's authority provided both symbolic and practical demonstration of the new kingdom's coherence. The standardization of weights, measures, and silver content across all English territories facilitated trade and economic development, while making royal authority visible in every market and transaction. The images and inscriptions on these coins proclaimed Edward's sovereignty over all English peoples, while establishing his dynasty's legitimacy in terms that both English and Danish populations could understand. The ecclesiastical reorganization that accompanied political unification created religious institutions capable of supporting and legitimizing the new English monarchy. The restoration of damaged churches the re-establishment of monastic communities that had been disrupted by Viking raids, the creation of new bishoprics that could serve both English and Danish populations, all contributed to a religious synthesis that paralleled the political integration occurring at the royal level. The vision of England that Edward bequeathed to his successors was radically different from the collection of competing kingdoms that had characterized the pre-Viking period. This was a unified realm with common institutions, shared legal traditions, integrated military and administrative systems, and a coherent sense of national identity that transcended the ethnic boundaries between English and Danish populations. The achievement was so complete that when Athelstan inherited the throne in 924, he could legitimately claim to be king of all the English rather than merely king of the West Saxons. The dream of England that had sustained Alfred through his darkest hours, that had inspired Ethelflaed's campaigns in the Midlands, that had guided Edward's patient integration of diverse territories, had finally become reality. The nation that emerged from this century of struggle was neither purely Anglo-Saxon nor purely Scandinavian, but something new in European history, a synthesis of Germanic peoples united by common law, common language, and common allegiance to a dynasty that had proven its worthiness through 3 generations of exceptional leadership. This England, forged in the crucible of Viking invasion, and tempered by the wisdom of Alfred's line, would endure for centuries as one of medieval Europe's most successful political achievements. The England that emerged from the crucible of Viking invasion and reconquest faced a moment of unprecedented possibility in 924, when Edward the Elder's death left his eldest son Athelstan to inherit not merely a kingdom, but the foundation of an empire. Yet the path to greatness was neither smooth nor certain, for the very success of English reunification had created new challenges that would test whether the vision of a unified English realm could survive the transition from one generation to the next. The young king who took the throne at Winchester in September 925 would prove worthy of his inheritance, transforming himself from regional monarch into the first ruler who could legitimately claim the title Rex Totius Britannia, King of all Britain. The struggle that marked Athelstan's early reign revealed the fragility of the unity that Edward and Ethelflaed had achieved through decades of careful military and diplomatic effort. Even after his half-brother Elfwerd's convenient death just 16 days after Edward's passing, opposition to Athelstan's succession persisted throughout Wessex, particularly in Winchester, where traditional West Saxon nobles viewed this Mercian-educated prince with suspicion and unease. The delay of more than a year between Edward's death and Athelstan's coronation at Kingston upon Thames in September 925 reflected not ceremonial preparation, but political necessity, as the new king carefully built the coalition of support that would allow him to govern effectively. The education that Athelstan had received at the Mercian court of his aunt Ethelflaed proved invaluable during this early crisis, for it had taught him to think beyond the narrow boundaries of traditional West Saxon kingship toward a broader conception of English unity. Where previous kings had been content to rule as first among equals, acknowledging the autonomy of client kingdoms and tributary peoples, Athelstan envisioned a realm where all English-speaking peoples would owe direct allegiance to a single crown. This vision, revolutionary in its implications, would guide his policies throughout a reign that transformed the very nature of English monarchy. The conquest of York in 927 marked the crucial moment when this vision became reality, as Athelstan's systematic reduction of the last independent Viking kingdom eliminated the final barrier to English territorial unity. The campaign that achieved this historic victory demonstrates the sophisticated military and political methods that distinguished Athelstan's reign from those of his predecessors, rather than relying solely on the traditional Anglo-Saxon tactics of siege and pitched battle. Athelstan coordinated land and naval forces in a combined operation that isolated York from both Scandinavian reinforcement and Irish support. The submission ceremony that followed York's fall established precedents for royal authority that would influence English political development for centuries. The assembled nobility of Northumbria, both English and Danish, knelt before Athelstan in acknowledgement that the age of separate kingdoms had ended forever. The silver coins minted to commemorate this achievement bore the proud inscription Rex Totius Britanniae, proclaiming to all Europe that a new power had emerged in the British Isles. Yet Athelstan's greatest military triumph came not in the systematic reduction of fortified towns, but on the battlefield of Brunanburh in 937, where the fate of English unity was decided in a single day of heroic combat that would be remembered in song and story for generations. The coalition that challenged English hegemony represented the last great alliance of the old Celtic and Scandinavian world against the rising power of unified England. Constantine II of Scotland, Owain of Strathclyde, and Olaf Guthfrithson brought together armies that stretched from the Highlands to the Irish Sea, united by their shared determination to prevent English domination of the British Isles. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's poetic account of the battle captures both the magnitude of the victory and its symbolic significance. Never yet in this island before this, by what books tell us and our ancient sages, was a greater slaughter of a host made by the edge of the sword since the Angles and Saxons came hither from the east. Invaders over broad seas sought Britain, proud warsmiths overcame the Welsh, glorious warriors seized the land. These words, written by a contemporary poet who understood the historical importance of what he was describing, place Brunanburh alongside the great victories of English history. The diplomatic revolution that followed Athelstan's military triumphs established England as a major European power for the first time since the Roman withdrawal. The marriages that he arranged for his sisters created a web of alliances that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Baltic, connecting the English court to the greatest royal houses of continental Europe. These diplomatic connections brought more than mere prestige. They opened England to cultural and intellectual influences that would enrich English civilization throughout the 10th century. The cultural flowering that occurred under Athelstan's patronage transformed the English court into one of the great centres of European learning and artistic achievement. The household scholars who gathered around the king represented the finest intellectual talent of their generation, men whose work in history, law, and theology influenced European thought far beyond England's borders. The manuscripts produced in royal scriptoriums during this period rival anything created in contemporary France or Italy, demonstrating that English culture had not merely survived the Viking invasions, but had emerged stronger and more sophisticated than ever. The integration of diverse peoples into a unified English identity represents perhaps Athelstan's most lasting achievement, as his reign witnessed the transformation of Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and Danes from competing ethnic groups into a single English nation. This process required more than military conquest. It demanded the creation of new legal, administrative, and cultural institutions that could accommodate diverse traditions while maintaining overall unity. The law codes that survive from Athelstan's reign reveal a sophisticated understanding of the challenges involved in governing a multi-ethnic society, combining traditional Germanic legal principles with innovative solutions to contemporary problems. The spiritual and intellectual renaissance that transformed English Christianity during the mid-10th century began not in the great cathedrals or royal courts, but in the modest workshops and scriptoriums, where three extraordinary men laboured to renew the monastic life that had been disrupted by generations of Viking warfare: Dunstan of Glastonbury, Ethelwald of Winchester, and Oswald of Worcester. The three great reformers whose names would be forever linked in the history of English monasticism shared a vision of religious renewal that extended far beyond mere institutional restoration to encompass a comprehensive transformation of English spiritual and cultural life. The world that these reformers sought to change was one where the great monastic traditions of the 7th and 8th centuries had largely disappeared, replaced by communities of secular canons who lived more like comfortable country gentlemen than disciplined religious. The wealth of ancient foundations like Glastonbury and Winchester continued to flow into clerical coffers, but the spiritual discipline and scholarly dedication that had once made English monasteries the envy of Europe had largely vanished. The schools where Bede and Alcuin had once taught lay in ruins, their libraries scattered or destroyed, their traditions of learning reduced to dim memories preserved only in dusty manuscripts. Dunstan's transformation of Glastonbury Abbey beginning around 940 demonstrated how effective leadership could revive dormant traditions and create new standards of religious life. The young monk who would later serve as Archbishop of Canterbury brought to his reforming work a combination of spiritual fervour and practical genius that proved capable of inspiring both individual dedication and institutional change. Under his guidance, Glastonbury became not merely a restored monastery, but a laboratory for religious innovation that would influence monastic development throughout England. The rule of St. Benedict, which Dunstan and his colleagues championed as the foundation of reformed monastic life, provided more than religious discipline. It offered a comprehensive programme for creating communities dedicated to prayer, learning, and productive labour. The Benedictine emphasis on stability, conversion of life and obedience created environments where scholarly work could flourish alongside spiritual development, while the rule's careful balance between communal worship and individual study provided the framework within which the great intellectual achievements of the later 10th century would unfold. Ethelwald's work at Winchester revealed how monastic reform could transform not just religious life, but the broader cultural and educational development of English society. The school that he established at Winchester Cathedral became the most important centre of learning in 10th century England, producing scholars, administrators, and bishops who would carry the ideals of the Benedictine revival throughout the kingdom. The curriculum that Ethelwald developed combined traditional monastic education in Latin grammar and rhetoric with advanced studies in mathematics, astronomy, and music that rivaled anything available in contemporary Europe. The Winchester School of Manuscript Illumination that flourished under Ethelwald's patronage created works of art that represent the highest achievement of Anglo-Saxon culture. The Winchester style that emerged from these scriptoriums combined traditional English interlace patterns with continental Carolingian influence and Byzantine decorative motifs to create a distinctly English artistic language that influenced European art for generations. The Benedictional of St. Ethelwald, with its extraordinary combination of golden backgrounds, jewel-like colours, and sophisticated iconographic programs, stands as perhaps the supreme masterpiece of medieval English art. Oswald's parallel work in the Midlands demonstrated how the Benedictine revival could adapt to different regional conditions while maintaining its essential character and purposes. The monasteries that he founded or reformed at Worcester, Ramsey, and other Midland centres became engines of economic development as well as spiritual renewal, their disciplined communities transforming agricultural wastelands into productive estates, while their schools educated the administrators who would govern England throughout the later 10th and 11th centuries. The economic impact of monastic reform extended far beyond the monasteries themselves to encompass fundamental changes in English agricultural and commercial development. The Benedictine emphasis on productive labour, combined with the security that reformed monasteries could provide for long-term investment, created conditions that encouraged agricultural innovation and expansion. The systematic drainage of fens and marshes, the improvement of existing farmland through new cultivation techniques, the development of water-powered mills and other technological innovations all reflected the prosperity and confidence that monastic reform had brought to English rural life. The educational expansion that accompanied the Benedictine revival created new opportunities for learning that extended beyond monastic communities to encompass cathedral schools, court schools, and even local parish churches. The standardization of Latin teaching methods, the systematic copying of essential texts, the training of teachers who could carry learning into previously unserved regions, all contributed to a dramatic expansion in English literacy and scholarly capability that would influence cultural development throughout the medieval period. The culmination of 10th century English achievement came during the reign of Edgar, whose epithet "the Peaceful" reflected not weakness or inactivity, but the confident strength of a ruler who governed an empire so secure in its foundations that military force was rarely necessary to maintain order. The king who ruled England from 959 to 975 inherited the territorial unity that Athelstan had achieved and the institutional reforms that the Benedictine revival had inspired, transforming these foundations into a system of government that would influence English political development for centuries. The coronation ceremony at Bath Abbey on Whitsunday 973 established new standards for royal ritual that combined Anglo-Saxon tradition with continental European influence to create a uniquely English expression of monarchical dignity. The delay of 14 years between Edgar's accession and his formal coronation reflected not political uncertainty, but careful preparation for a ceremony that would proclaim England's emergence as a major European power. The service itself, conducted with magnificent pageantry that drew observers from across Europe, established precedents for English coronation ritual that would endure well into the modern period. The symbolic climax of Edgar's reign came immediately after his coronation, when 8 tributary kings rode his royal barge down the River Dee at Chester in a ceremony that proclaimed English supremacy throughout the British Isles. The kings of Scotland, Wales, and the surviving Celtic kingdoms all participated in this elaborate demonstration of Edgar's imperial authority, their presence confirming that the age of independent Celtic kingdoms had ended with the rise of unified England. The image of tributary monarchs serving as oarsmen for the English king became one of the most powerful symbols of medieval English imperial ideology. The legal codification that Edgar achieved during his reign created the foundation of English common law that would influence legal development throughout the English-speaking world. The systematic compilation of earlier Anglo-Saxon legal traditions, combined with innovative solutions to contemporary problems, produced a comprehensive legal system that balanced royal authority with individual rights, national unity with local autonomy, traditional custom with practical necessity. The laws that bear Edgar's name established principles of due process, equal justice, and limited government that would prove remarkably durable throughout English legal history. The integration of English and Danish legal traditions under Edgar's authority demonstrated how effective monarchy could transform potential sources of conflict into foundations of strength. Rather than attempting to impose uniform legal standards throughout his realm, Edgar developed flexible arrangements that preserved local customs while establishing clear mechanisms for royal authority. The recognition of Danish law in the former Danelaw, combined with guarantees of English legal rights throughout the kingdom, created a legal synthesis that satisfied both ethnic communities while strengthening overall national unity. The economic prosperity that characterized Edgar's reign created conditions that supported cultural and artistic achievement throughout English society. The expansion of trade connections with continental Europe, the development of new urban centres, the improvement of agricultural productivity, the standardization of coinage and weights and measures, all contributed to a general prosperity that allowed England to support institutions and activities that would have been impossible in earlier, less prosperous periods. The monetary reforms that Edgar implemented created the most sophisticated coinage system in contemporary Europe, with standardized silver pennies minted at carefully regulated locations throughout England. The artistic quality of these coins, with their detailed royal portraits and proud inscriptions, proclaimed English prosperity and political sophistication to traders and diplomats throughout the known world. The economic stability that this monetary system provided supported the commercial expansion that made late Anglo-Saxon England one of the wealthiest regions of medieval Europe. Cultural confidence during Edgar's reign expressed itself through architectural projects, artistic patronage, and scholarly activities that reflected England's emergence as a major European power. The great churches built during this period rivaled anything being constructed in contemporary Francia or Germany, while the manuscripts produced in English scriptoriums were sought after by collectors throughout Europe. The scholars who worked in Edgar's court maintained correspondence with intellectual centres from Ireland to Byzantium, demonstrating that English learning had regained the international respect it had enjoyed during the age of Bede and Alcuin. The England that Edgar ruled in the third quarter of the 10th century was a land transformed, where prosperity and peace had created conditions that allowed ordinary people to enjoy standards of living that would have seemed impossible to their grandparents who had lived through the Viking invasions, in villages scattered across the English countryside, in the growing towns where craftsmen and merchants gathered, In the great estates where nobles lived in halls that rivaled royal palaces in their comfort and sophistication, the rhythms of daily life reflected the prosperity and cultural confidence that political unification had made possible. Village communities throughout England during this period organised their lives around the agricultural cycles that had governed English rural life since the first Anglo-Saxon settlements. Yet the security that strong royal government provided had allowed these communities to develop more complex and prosperous forms of social organisation. The typical English village of Edgar's reign included not just the peasant farmers whose labour supported the entire social system, but also specialised craftsmen whose skills served both local needs and distant markets, traders who connected rural communities to urban centres, and local officials whose administrative responsibilities linked village life to royal government. The great manor houses that dominated the English countryside during this period reflected both the prosperity of the landed nobility and the sophisticated material culture that peace and prosperity had made possible. Archaeological evidence from sites like North Elmham and Cheddar reveals residential complexes that included not just the great halls where lords entertained their followers, but also specialised buildings for different domestic functions, workshops where skilled craftsmen produced luxury goods, and storage facilities that could preserve the agricultural surplus that supported aristocratic lifestyles. The rhythm of agricultural life continued to follow the seasonal patterns established by centuries of farming experience. Yet the tools and techniques available to English farmers had improved dramatically during the peaceful decades of the mid-10th century. Iron ploughshares were more readily available than ever before, allowing farmers to work heavier soils that had previously been unproductive. Water-powered mills, constructed with the surplus capital that prosperity had made available, freed rural communities from dependence on hand grinding for their grain processing. New crops introduced through expanding trade connections provided additional sources of nutrition and income. Urban growth during Edgar's reign created new opportunities for social mobility and economic advancement that had been impossible during the uncertain conditions of earlier periods. Towns like London, Winchester, York, and Chester developed into sophisticated commercial centres where skilled craftsmen could find ready markets for their products, where merchants could organise trading ventures that stretched across Europe, where ambitious peasants could escape the limitations of rural life to build new forms of prosperity based on commercial success rather than agricultural production. The emergence of a recognisable middle class during this period represents one of the most significant social developments of late Anglo-Saxon England. Neither noble nor peasant, these prosperous merchants, skilled craftsmen and successful farmers created new forms of wealth that challenged traditional social hierarchies while supporting the cultural and artistic achievements that characterized the later 10th century. Their houses, furnished with imported luxuries and decorated with sophisticated artwork, revealed standards of living that approached those of the traditional nobility. Social mobility, while still limited by the conventions of a fundamentally hierarchical society, became more common during Edgar's reign as economic prosperity created new opportunities for advancement. The Church provided one traditional path for ambitious young men from modest backgrounds to achieve high social position, while the expanding royal administration offered new opportunities for educated individuals to serve in positions of authority and responsibility. Military service, particularly in the increasingly professional Royal Guard, continued to provide opportunities for advancement based on personal valour and skill. The roles available to women in late Anglo-Saxon society reflected both traditional limitations and new opportunities created by increasing prosperity and social complexity. While most women continued to live within the domestic sphere, managing households and raising children according to patterns established by centuries of custom, the expansion of textile production created new opportunities for women to contribute directly to family income through skilled work that was highly valued in both local and international markets. Religious life during Edgar's reign penetrated every aspect of daily existence, from the elaborate ceremonies that marked the great festivals of the Christian year to the simple prayers that accompanied routine domestic activities. The network of parish churches that covered England by the mid-10th century brought Christian teaching and sacramental life within reach of virtually every English community, while the great monasteries served as centres of learning and artistic achievement that influenced cultural development throughout the kingdom. The technological innovations that transformed daily life during this period reflected both the prosperity that made investment in new techniques possible and the international connections that brought knowledge of foreign innovations to English craftsmen and farmers. The widespread adoption of the heavy plough revolutionized English agriculture, while improvements in metalworking techniques produced tools and weapons that were superior to anything available in earlier periods. The development of more efficient mills, both water-powered and windmill designs introduced from the continent, freed human labour for other productive activities while improving the quality of processed grain. Material culture during Edgar's reign reached levels of sophistication that rivaled anything produced in contemporary Europe. The jewellery, pottery, textiles and metalwork produced by English craftsmen during this period combined traditional Anglo-Saxon design elements with influences from Scandinavia, Francia, and even the Byzantine Empire to create distinctly English styles that were admired throughout medieval Europe. The archaeological evidence from urban excavations reveals communities that enjoyed access to luxury goods from across the known world, reflecting both England's commercial connections and the prosperity that allowed ordinary people to purchase goods that had once been reserved for the nobility. The England that Edgar left to his successors in 975 was a land that had achieved a remarkable balance between tradition and innovation, between local autonomy and national unity, between material prosperity and spiritual achievement. The daily lives of English people, from the humblest peasant to the most exalted noble, reflected the confidence and prosperity of a civilization that had not merely survived the challenges of the Viking Age, but had emerged stronger, wiser, and more capable of great achievements than ever before in its history. The death of Edgar the Peaceful in 975 marked the end of the Golden Age that had seen England emerge as the dominant power in the British Isles, unified in law and administration, prosperous in trade and agriculture, confident in its cultural achievements. Yet the very success of 10th century England had created conditions that would prove its undoing, as the wealth accumulated through decades of peace attracted new generations of Scandinavian raiders, while the political unity achieved through Edgar's strong kingship began to fragment under the pressures of disputed succession and divided loyalty. The century that followed would test every institution that Anglo-Saxon civilization had created, ultimately revealing both the strengths and fatal weaknesses of the world that Alfred's descendants had built. The reign of Ethelred, who came to the throne as a child in 978 after his half-brother Edward's murder at Corfe Castle, has suffered from one of history's most persistent misunderstandings, as the epithet unready has been mistranslated by generations of chroniclers who failed to grasp its true meaning. The Old English unread did not mean unprepared but rather ill-counselled, or without good advice, a bitter commentary on the factional struggles that plagued the young king's court, rather than any personal failing of preparation or courage. This linguistic confusion has obscured the tragedy of a reign that witnessed the gradual collapse of the unified English state under pressures that no amount of individual heroism could have overcome. The political crisis that engulfed England during Ethelred's minority reflected deeper structural problems within the Anglo-Saxon system of governance. The very success of Edgar's centralised monarchy had created powerful noble families whose wealth and territorial holdings made them semi-independent potentates, while the integration of Danish settlers into English society had created divided loyalties that could be exploited by external enemies. The murder of Edward the Martyr, whether planned or spontaneous, revealed the depth of these divisions while providing Scandinavian propagandists with powerful arguments about the illegitimacy of Ethelred's rule. The return of Viking raiders to English shores beginning in the 980s represented more than a simple revival of 9th century patterns of warfare. It reflected the emergence of new Scandinavian powers whose military capabilities and political ambitions far exceeded those of earlier generations. The Kingdom of Denmark under Harald Bluetooth and his successors had evolved from a collection of competing warbands into a sophisticated state capable of organizing military campaigns on an unprecedented scale, while the rise of powerful Norwegian kings like Olaf Tryggvason created additional sources of pressure on English defences. Olaf Tryggvason's arrival in English waters around 991 demonstrated the new level of Viking military organisation and strategic thinking that would characterise this second wave of Scandinavian expansion. Unlike the opportunistic raiders of earlier centuries, Olaf commanded professional armies equipped with the finest weapons and armour available in contemporary Europe, supported by fleets that could transport thousands of warriors across the North Sea with reliable precision. His victory over Berthnoth's forces at the Battle of Moldon in 991 revealed not just superior Viking tactics, but also the relative decline in English military effectiveness that 3 generations of peace had produced. The policy of Dangelb that Ethelred adopted in response to these renewed Viking pressures reflected both the wealth that peaceful development had created and the political paralysis that factional conflict had produced. Rather than mobilizing the military resources that had enabled his predecessors to defeat earlier Viking invasions, Ethelred chose to purchase temporary respite through massive payments of silver that ultimately encouraged rather than deterred Scandinavian ambitions. Between 991 and 1016, English governments paid out more than £250,000 of silver to Viking armies, a sum that represented perhaps a quarter of England's total monetary wealth and demonstrated both the kingdom's prosperity and its political dysfunction. The tragic irony of the Danegeld policy was that it advertised English wealth to every ambitious chieftain in Scandinavia, while simultaneously weakening the military institutions that alone could provide effective defence. Each payment attracted new bands of raiders seeking their share of English silver, while the heavy taxation required to fund these payments generated resentment among the English population and reduced the resources available for military preparation. The policy that was intended to preserve peace instead guaranteed perpetual warfare while gradually transferring England's accumulated wealth to its enemies. The arrival of Svein Forkbeard's forces in 1003 marked the escalation from raiding to systematic conquest that would ultimately bring down the Anglo-Saxon kingdom. Svein, who had already established his authority over much of Denmark and Norway, saw England not as a source of temporary plunder, but as the potential centrepiece of a North Sea empire that would rival the greatest powers of medieval Europe. His campaigns combined the tactical expertise of professional Viking armies with the strategic vision of a ruler who understood that lasting conquest required political as well as military success. The Saint, Bryce's Day massacre of November 13, 1002, represented perhaps the greatest political miscalculation in English medieval history, as Ethelred's attempt to eliminate Danish settlers through coordinated ethnic violence provided Svein Forkbeard with the moral justification he needed for his conquest of England. The massacre, ordered in response to reports of a Danish conspiracy against the king's life, revealed the depth of ethnic tensions that still divided English society, despite decades of apparent integration. More importantly, it demonstrated the breakdown of the legal and political institutions that had successfully managed these tensions under stronger royal leadership. The consequences of the massacre extended far beyond its immediate victims to encompass the complete collapse of the political consensus that had supported Anglo-Saxon rule. Danish settlers who had lived peacefully in England for generations found themselves suddenly transformed into enemy aliens, while English communities that had benefited from Danish commercial connections discovered that royal policy now made them suspects in their neighbours' eyes. The unity that Edgar had achieved through inclusive governance was shattered by a policy that forced every resident to choose sides in an ethnic conflict that had previously been managed through legal and administrative mechanisms. Svein's systematic conquest of England between 1003 and 1013 demonstrated the military superiority that professional Scandinavian armies had achieved over the traditional Anglo-Saxon defence system. The Danish forces that ravaged the English countryside during these campaigns were not the opportunistic warbands of earlier centuries, but disciplined military units capable of coordinating complex operations across multiple theatres of warfare. Their success reflected not just individual courage or tactical skill, but superior organisation, equipment, and strategic planning that the fractured English resistance could not match. The final collapse came in 1013, when Ethelred fled into Norman exile and Svein was acknowledged as king by the English nobility. The ceremony at which the last Anglo-Saxon king surrendered his crown marked the end of nearly 6 centuries of Germanic rule in England. Yet it also revealed the complex loyalties and practical calculations that governed medieval political allegiance. Many English nobles who submitted to Svein did so not from cowardice, but from recognition that effective government required unified command, something that Ethelred's faction-ridden court had been unable to provide. The death of Svein Forkbeard in February 1014, just months after his triumph over Ethelred, created a succession crisis that would ultimately bring to the English throne one of the most remarkable rulers of the medieval period. Cnut, barely 20 years old when he inherited his father's unfinished conquest, would prove capable not merely of completing the Danish takeover of England, but of transforming that military achievement into one of medieval Europe's most successful experiments in multi-ethnic governance. The reign that began with the brutal elimination of potential rivals would evolve into a model of how conquered and conquerors could be integrated into a single political community. The restoration of Danish rule in 1016, following Knut's decisive victory over Edmund Ironside at Sandon, represented more than a simple change of dynasty. It marked England's integration into a Scandinavian empire that stretched from the Irish Sea to the Baltic, from the Arctic Ocean to the North Sea. This was not the loose confederation of warbands that earlier Viking leaders had assembled, but a sophisticated political structure capable of coordinating military, commercial and diplomatic activities across vast distances and diverse populations. England, the wealthiest and most administratively advanced component of this empire, would serve as its de facto capital, while providing the resources necessary to maintain Scandinavian dominance throughout northern Europe. Knut's early years as king reveal a political intelligence that belies his youth and Viking origins, as he systematically eliminated potential sources of resistance while carefully preserving the institutional structures that had made England worth conquering. The execution of prominent English nobles like Edric Streona, who had betrayed their own king to support the Danish cause, demonstrated that the new ruler understood the importance of loyalty and would tolerate opportunism from no one, regardless of their previous services. Yet these same executions were balanced by generous treatment of nobles who had remained faithful to English causes, creating a message that resistance would be punished, but honourable surrender would be rewarded. The conversion to Christianity that Knut announced shortly after securing his throne represented far more than political calculation, though calculation certainly played a role in his decision. By embracing the religion of his English subjects, by patronising the same monasteries that his armies had recently plundered, by adopting the ceremonial and legal traditions of Anglo-Saxon kingship, Knut was proclaiming his intention to rule as an English king rather than as a foreign conqueror. This transformation required him to repudiate much of his Scandinavian heritage, yet it also provided him with legitimacy that no amount of military success could have achieved. The political synthesis that Knut achieved during his 20-year reign created conditions of prosperity and stability that rivaled the greatest periods of Anglo-Saxon achievement. The integration of Danish military efficiency with English administrative sophistication produced a governmental system that was both more effective and more responsive than anything that had existed under purely English rule. Danish concepts of legal equality and individual rights complemented Anglo-Saxon traditions of consultation and consent to create hybrid institutions that satisfied both ethnic communities while advancing the practical business of governance. The development of English administrative efficiency under Knut's rule reflected his understanding that lasting political success required more than military dominance. It demanded institutional innovations that could survive individual royal deaths and political transitions. The system of royal government that emerged during his reign combined the best features of Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon political traditions, while adding new elements that reflected the unique challenges of governing a multi-ethnic empire. The ealdormen who administered local government under Knut's authority were selected for their competence rather than their ethnic origins, creating a meritocratic element in English governance that had not existed under previous rulers. The prosperity that characterized England during Knut's reign demonstrated how effective government could transform potential sources of conflict into foundations of strength. The wealth that Ethelred had squandered on Danegeld payments was redirected toward productive investments in agriculture, commerce, and urban development that benefited all social classes. The security that Knut's military strength provided encouraged trade connections throughout northern Europe, while his diplomatic relationships with continental powers opened new markets for English goods and services. The paradox of Knut's success lay in the fact that England prospered under foreign rule in ways that it had not under native kings, raising profound questions about the relationship between ethnic identity and political effectiveness. The Danish king who had conquered England through violence proved more capable of governing English subjects than the English kings who had inherited their thrones by right of birth. This success reflected not just Knut's personal abilities, but also the advantages that came from ruling without the factional obligations and ethnic prejudices that had paralysed his Anglo-Saxon predecessors. The integration with the broader Scandinavian empire that Knut ruled provided England with international connections and strategic advantages that purely insular rule could never have achieved. English merchants gained access to commercial networks that stretched from Greenland to Constantinople, while English scholars and craftsmen found opportunities throughout northern Europe that had been closed to them under Anglo-Saxon rule. The cultural exchange that resulted from these connections enriched English civilization while spreading English influences throughout the Scandinavian world. The legal innovations that Knut introduced demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of the challenges involved in governing diverse populations with conflicting legal traditions. Rather than attempting to impose uniform Danish law throughout his domains, he developed flexible arrangements that preserved local customs while establishing clear mechanisms for imperial authority. The law codes that bear his name represent masterful syntheses of Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon legal principles, creating hybrid systems that satisfied both ethnic communities while advancing the practical requirements of effective governance. The restoration of the House of Wessex in 1042, when the English nobility chose Edward the Confessor over Knut's sons to inherit the English throne, marked not a return to Anglo-Saxon traditions, but the beginning of a new phase in English political development that would ultimately lead to the Norman conquest. Edward, who had spent 25 years in Norman exile during the Danish occupation, brought to the throne continental connections and political perspectives that would gradually transform the character of English government while creating the succession crisis that would destroy the Anglo-Saxon kingdom. The election of Edward by the English Witan represented a conscious choice to restore native rule after a generation of foreign domination, yet the king who emerged from this restoration was hardly the traditional Anglo-Saxon monarch that his supporters expected. Edward's long exile in Normandy had shaped his political outlook, his cultural preferences and his personal loyalties in ways that made him as much a continental as an English king. The Norman courtiers, clerics, and advisers whom he brought with him to England would gradually alter the balance of power within the Anglo-Saxon court, while creating resentments that would plague his entire reign. The continental connections that Edward maintained throughout his reign reflected both his personal history and his understanding of England's strategic position within the broader European political system. The marriages that he arranged for members of his court, the diplomatic relationships that he cultivated with continental rulers, the ecclesiastical appointments that he made, all demonstrated his conviction that England's future lay in closer integration with continental European civilization rather than in isolation within the British Isles. The Norman influence that permeated Edward's court was most visible in his ecclesiastical appointments, as he systematically promoted continental clerics to English bishoprics, while marginalizing the Anglo-Saxon clergy who had supported the restoration of native rule. These appointments brought contemporary continental learning and religious practices to England, yet they also created resentments among English ecclesiastics who found themselves excluded from positions that they considered rightfully theirs. The resulting tensions would contribute to the political instability that characterized Edward's reign, while providing Norman propagandists with arguments about the legitimacy of continental intervention in English affairs. The crisis that erupted in 1051 over the appointment of Robert of Jumièges as Archbishop of Canterbury revealed the depth of opposition to Edward's Norman policies, while demonstrating the continuing power of the great Anglo-Saxon noble families. Godwin of Wessex, who had initially supported Edward's restoration, found himself increasingly alienated by royal policies that seemed to favour foreign interests over English traditions. The confrontation that followed brought England to the brink of civil war while establishing precedents for noble resistance to royal authority that would influence English political development throughout the medieval period. The exile of the Godwin family between 1051 and 1052 provided Edward with his only opportunity to govern England according to his own preferences, without the constraints imposed by powerful Anglo-Saxon nobles. During this brief interlude, Norman influence reached its peak at the English court, with continental advisers managing royal administration, while Norman knights strengthened royal military forces. Yet this experiment in Norman-style monarchy proved unsustainable in the face of popular support for the exiled family and the military resources that Godwin could mobilize from his continental connections. The restoration of the Godwins in 1052 marked the effective end of Edward's personal rule, as the king was forced to accept the dominance of the very noble family whose power he had sought to break. Harold Godwinson's emergence as the de facto ruler of England during the last years of Edward's reign reflected both his personal abilities and the institutional constraints that limited royal authority within the Anglo-Saxon political system. The partnership that developed between the nominally sovereign king and his overwhelmingly powerful subject created a form of dual government that satisfied neither party while preparing the ground for the succession crisis that would follow Edward's death. The building of Westminster Abbey, Edward's greatest architectural achievement, symbolized both his personal piety and his political aspirations while creating a physical monument that would outlive the dynasty that constructed it. The abbey, built in the latest Norman Romanesque style and far surpassing any previous English ecclesiastical building in scale and sophistication, proclaimed Edward's determination to make England a worthy participant in contemporary European Christian civilization. Yet the enormous expense of the project, coming at a time when military pressures demanded increased royal revenues, contributed to the financial difficulties that weakened Edward's government. The succession crisis that developed during the final years of Edward's reign reflected the fundamental problem of Anglo-Saxon monarchy: the lack of clear rules for royal succession that could prevent disputed transitions. Edward's childless marriage to Edith, daughter of Godwin of Wessex, had been arranged for political reasons that precluded the emotional intimacy necessary for procreation, while his apparent preference for celibacy reflected religious convictions that prioritized spiritual achievement over dynastic responsibilities. The resulting uncertainty about the succession created opportunities for multiple claimants while weakening the institution of monarchy itself. The promise of the English succession that Edward allegedly made to William of Normandy during the early years of his reign would become the central justification for the Norman conquest. Yet the circumstances surrounding this promise remain among the most controversial questions in medieval English history. Whether Edward actually made such a promise, whether he had the authority to bind his successors, whether subsequent events released him from any obligations he may have incurred, all these questions would be debated by contemporaries and historians without reaching definitive conclusions. What matters is that William believed he had legitimate claims to the English throne and was prepared to enforce those claims through military action. The oath that Harold Godwinson allegedly swore to William of Normandy during his visit to the Norman court in 1064 or 1065 provided additional Norman justification for the conquest, while revealing the complex web of obligations and loyalties that governed relationships between medieval rulers. According to Norman sources, Harold swore to support William's claim to the English succession, in return for his release from Norman captivity, yet English sources deny that any such oath was ever given. The truth of these competing claims may never be established, but their political implications were clear. William had constructed a legal justification for conquest that satisfied contemporary standards of legitimate warfare. The assembly of the English Witan that met in London during the first days of January 1066 faced a decision that would determine not merely the identity of the next king, but the future character of English civilization itself. The death of Edward the Confessor on January 5th had left England without an obvious heir, yet the political realities that governed the kingdom made Harold Godwinson's election virtually inevitable. As Earl of Wessex, commander of the English army, and the most powerful noble in the realm, Harold possessed the military resources and political support necessary to defend England against the foreign invasions that were already being planned in Normandy and Norway. The choice that the Witan made in electing Harold represented a conscious decision to maintain English independence against foreign domination, yet it also reflected practical calculations about military necessity that transcended abstract questions of legitimacy. The threats that England faced in 1066 required a warrior king capable of mobilizing the kingdom's military resources while commanding the personal loyalty of the Anglo-Saxon nobility. Harold, despite the controversial circumstances that had brought his family to power, possessed these qualifications to a degree that no other potential candidate could match. The coronation ceremony that took place at Westminster Abbey on January 6, 1066, established Harold as England's anointed king while providing him with the sacred legitimacy that Anglo-Saxon tradition demanded. Yet even as Archbishop Ealdred of York performed the ancient rituals that transformed a powerful earl into a divinely sanctioned monarch, the new king must have been aware that his reign would be measured not in years but in months. As the invasion fleets gathering across the North Sea and English Channel prepared to test his authority in the ultimate court of medieval judgment trial by battle, the military preparations that consumed Harold's attention throughout the spring and summer of 1066 demonstrated both the sophistication of Anglo-Saxon military organization and the enormous challenges facing any ruler who attempted to defend England against simultaneous invasions from multiple directions. The southern coast, where William of Normandy was expected to land, required continuous surveillance and fortification, while the northern approaches remained vulnerable to Norwegian attacks that could coordinate with Scottish and Irish allies. The resources necessary to guard both frontiers simultaneously strained even England's considerable military capabilities. The dismissal of the southern militia in September 1066, when Harold could no longer afford to maintain his forces in the field while harvest season demanded their return to agricultural duties, represented one of the tragic miscalculations that would contribute to the ultimate failure of Anglo-Saxon resistance. This decision, forced by practical considerations rather than strategic choice, left the southern coast temporarily undefended just as favourable winds finally enabled William's invasion fleet to cross the English Channel. The timing was purely coincidental, yet its consequences were decisive. The Norwegian invasion that began in early September under Harald Hardrada's leadership created the strategic dilemma that would prove fatal to Harold's cause: the impossibility of defending England against simultaneous attacks from north and south with the military resources available to any 11th century kingdom. Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king, brought to England an invasion force that may have exceeded 15,000 men, transported in more than 300 ships, creating a northern threat that demanded immediate attention regardless of developments in the south. The forced march that carried Harold's army from London to Yorkshire in just 5 days demonstrated the mobility and discipline that Anglo-Saxon military organisation could achieve under exceptional leadership, yet it also revealed the physical and logistical limitations that constrained medieval warfare. The army that fought at Stamford Bridge on September 25th had covered nearly 200 miles in less than a week, an achievement that required extraordinary endurance from both men and horses, while placing enormous strains on supply systems that were already stretched to their limits. The Battle of Stamford Bridge marked the end of the Viking Age in English history, as Harold's decisive victory eliminated the last serious Norse threat to English independence, while demonstrating the continued effectiveness of Anglo-Saxon military methods when properly employed. The death of Harold Hardrada, along with Harold's exiled brother Tostig, removed two of the most dangerous claimants to the English throne, while providing Harold with the military prestige necessary to rally English resistance against the Norman invasion that was already underway. Yet the victory at Stamford Bridge also weakened Harold's forces at the crucial moment when Norman armies were landing on the Sussex coast, creating the strategic paradox that would determine the battle's ultimate historical significance. The English army that had triumphed over the greatest Viking king of the age was left exhausted and depleted just as it faced the greatest challenge in its history. The casualties suffered in the northern campaign, combined with the physical exhaustion of the forced marches that had made victory possible, reduced English military capabilities precisely when they were most desperately needed. The news of William's landing at Pevensey on September 28th reached Harold while he was still celebrating his northern triumph at York, creating the cruel irony that his greatest military success had occurred at the moment of his strategic failure. The Norman invasion that he had spent months preparing to repel had finally materialized while his army was 300 miles away, fighting battles that had been forced upon him by circumstances beyond his control. The race back to the south would test every aspect of Anglo-Saxon military organization while providing William with precious time to consolidate his beachhead and prepare for the decisive confrontation. The Battle of Hastings on October 14th, 1066, represented the culmination of centuries of Anglo-Saxon military development, as Harold deployed his forces according to tactics that had served English armies since the time of Alfred the Great. The shield wall formation that had broken Viking charges at Stamford Bridge would face its ultimate test against Norman cavalry and archers, while the discipline and courage that had made Anglo-Saxon infantry the most feared foot soldiers in northern Europe would be measured against the most sophisticated military techniques available in contemporary Europe. The day-long struggle that ensued revealed both the strengths and limitations of Anglo-Saxon military methods, as Harold's forces initially repelled Norman attacks, while maintaining the defensive positions that had served them well in previous battles. The heavily armoured housecarls who formed the core of the English army demonstrated their individual prowess in combat, while the 3rd Militia showed remarkable discipline under pressure. Yet the absence of cavalry and the shortage of archers that had not mattered against Viking opponents proved decisive disadvantages against Norman forces that combined all arms in coordinated attacks. The death of Harold, whether by arrow wound or sword stroke, marked not merely the end of a reign, but the conclusion of 6 centuries of Anglo-Saxon rule in England. The king who had been elected to preserve English independence died defending the ancient ways against continental innovation, his death symbolizing the victory of Norman military methods over traditional Anglo-Saxon tactics. The leaderless English army that broke and fled as darkness fell carried with them into exile the remnants of a civilization that had once illuminated all Europe with its learning and achievements. The scattering of Harold's defeated forces as night descended over the battlefield at Hastings represented more than military defeat. It marked the end of Anglo-Saxon England and the beginning of a new era in which continental European influences would reshape every aspect of English life. The crown that William would claim on Christmas Day 1066 carried with it not just royal authority, but the responsibility for governing a conquered people whose traditions, laws and language would gradually disappear under Norman rule. The England that emerged from this transformation would be neither Anglo-Saxon nor Norman, but something entirely new, a synthesis of Germanic heritage and continental innovation that would eventually spread English influence throughout the world. The blood-soaked field at Hastings, where Harold Godwinson's broken body lay among the flower of Anglo-Saxon nobility, seemed to mark not just the end of a dynasty, but the extinction of an entire civilization. As Norman knights picked through the aftermath of their victory and William of Normandy prepared to claim his conquered crown, observers might have concluded that 6 centuries of Germanic achievement in Britain had come to nothing, that the language, laws and customs of the Anglo-Saxons would vanish as completely as the Roman world they had once replaced. Yet beneath the immediate trauma of conquest, deeper currents of influence continued to flow, carrying the essential genius of Anglo-Saxon civilization forward into ages yet unborn, ensuring that their greatest achievements would outlive not only their political independence, but the very memory of the kingdoms they had built. The most profound and enduring gift that the Anglo-Saxons bequeathed to the world was the language itself, that remarkable fusion of Germanic grammar and vocabulary, with Celtic, Latin, and eventually Norman French, influences that would evolve into the most widely spoken tongue in human history. What began as the crude dialect of Germanic migrants became, through centuries of literary refinement and cultural synthesis, the foundation upon which Shakespeare would build his cosmic dramas, Milton would construct his epic visions, and countless generations of poets, philosophers, and storytellers would give voice to humanity's deepest aspirations and fears. The transformation from tribal dialect to literary language represents one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of human communication. The Germanic tongues that the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes carried across the North Sea in their migration ships were practical instruments of daily life languages, adequate for describing the routines of farming and fighting, trading and praying, but lacking the sophisticated vocabulary necessary for complex abstract thought or artistic expression. Through contact with Latin learning in the monasteries, through absorption of Celtic poetic traditions, through the patient work of scholars like Bede and Alfred who translated continental masterworks into the vernacular, Old English gradually acquired the flexibility and richness that would make it capable of expressing the full range of human experience. The vocabulary of daily life that modern English inherits from its Anglo-Saxon ancestors reveals the fundamental Germanic character that survived even the massive influx of Norman French words that followed 1066. The most basic words we use house, man, woman, child, father, mother, bread, water, earth, sky, all derive directly from Old English roots that can be traced back to the original Germanic homeland. These are not merely linguistic curiosities, but windows into the Anglo-Saxon soul, revealing a people whose language prioritized the concrete over the abstract, the practical over the theoretical, the human scale over the grandiose. The poetic traditions that the Anglo-Saxons developed represent perhaps their greatest contribution to world literature, creating forms and techniques that would influence English verse throughout its subsequent history. The alliterative metre that structures Beowulf and the other great works of Anglo-Saxon poetry operates according to principles fundamentally different from the syllabic systems borrowed from classical antiquity, creating rhythms that mirror the natural stresses of spoken English while providing frameworks capable of supporting both epic grandeur and intimate lyricism. Even after rhyming verse became dominant in Middle English poetry, the alliterative tradition survived in popular ballads and folk songs, eventually experiencing a renaissance in modern poets like Gerard Manley Hopkins and W.H. Auden, who recognized its unique capacity for capturing the music of English speech. The written culture that Anglo-Saxon scholars created provided the institutional foundation upon which later English literary achievement would build. The decision to develop a comprehensive literature in the vernacular language, rather than confining serious writing to Latin as was common throughout medieval Europe, created precedents and traditions that would prove crucial to England's later cultural development. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, with its commitment to recording English history in the English language, established the principle that a people's story should be told in their own tongue. The legal codes that survive from Anglo-Saxon England demonstrate the sophisticated use of vernacular prose for complex technical purposes, while the religious poetry and prose translations show how the language could be adapted to serve the highest spiritual and intellectual needs. The foundation that Anglo-Saxon literary culture provided for later English achievement cannot be overstated. When Chaucer chose to write in Middle English rather than Latin or French, he was following precedents established by Alfred's translation programme. When Shakespeare populated his plays with Germanic words that carried emotional weight no Latin borrowing could match, He was drawing on a vocabulary preserved through centuries of Anglo-Saxon literary tradition. When the King James Bible achieved its magnificent synthesis of majesty and accessibility, its translators were building on techniques of vernacular religious literature pioneered in Anglo-Saxon monasteries. The great tradition of English literature, from medieval alliterative romance through Renaissance drama to modern poetry and fiction, rests on foundations laid by scribes and scholars whose names are mostly forgotten, but whose work continues to shape how millions of people think and feel and dream. The political institutions that the Anglo-Saxons developed during their 6 centuries of rule in England established precedents and principles that would prove far more durable than the kingdoms that created them. While Norman conquest swept away the external forms of Anglo-Saxon government, the deeper concepts of law and political authority that had evolved during the Germanic settlement survived to influence English constitutional development throughout the medieval period and beyond. The ideas of consensual government, individual rights, and limited royal authority that would eventually flower into parliamentary democracy and constitutional monarchy can all be traced back to practices and principles first articulated in Anglo-Saxon England. The Witan, that assembly of wise men who advised Anglo-Saxon kings and participated in the election of their successors, established the crucial precedent that royal authority should be exercised in consultation with representatives of the governed community. Unlike the continental assemblies of the same period, which were typically dominated by great nobles and high ecclesiastics, the Anglo-Saxon Witan included representatives of the free peasantry, whose voices could influence royal policy on matters ranging from taxation to military service. This tradition of broad-based consultation created habits of consensual government that would prove impossible for even the most autocratic Norman and Angevin kings to entirely suppress. The development of common law under Anglo-Saxon rule created legal principles that would eventually spread throughout the English-speaking world and influence jurisprudence far beyond the boundaries of any single nation. The Anglo-Saxon conception of law as emerging from custom and precedent, rather than royal decree, established the foundation for legal systems based on judicial decision rather than administrative fiat. The principle that even kings were subject to law, demonstrated repeatedly in Anglo-Saxon history when rulers who violated traditional rights faced noble resistance or popular rebellion, created constitutional precedents that would prove crucial during later conflicts between Crown and Parliament. Local government institutions developed by the Anglo-Saxons provided models for decentralized administration that balanced national unity with regional autonomy. The shire courts and 100 meetings that governed daily life in Anglo-Saxon England created participatory institutions where free men could pursue justice, resolve disputes, and participate in the administration of their communities. These assemblies operated according to principles of collective responsibility and mutual obligation that fostered civic engagement while providing practical training in self-government for thousands of ordinary citizens. The Anglo-Saxon concept of kingship as service rather than tyranny established ideological foundations that would influence English political thought throughout the medieval period and beyond. Unlike continental theories that emphasize divine right and absolute authority, Anglo-Saxon political tradition portrayed kings as leaders chosen by their people to serve their community's needs. This conception of royal authority as conditional upon effective service created expectations and obligations that limited autocratic tendencies while encouraging responsive government. The oath that Anglo-Saxon kings took at their coronations, promising to protect the church, maintain justice and govern according to law, established contractual relationships between ruler and a rule that prefigured later constitutional limitations on royal power. Individual rights within community obligations represented perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Anglo-Saxon political theory, as their legal codes attempted to balance personal freedom with collective responsibility in ways that protected both individual dignity and social stability. The concept of Vergild, while often misunderstood as primitive vengeance, actually represented a sophisticated system of conflict resolution that provided legal remedies for social violence while preserving individual rights to compensation and community peace. The legal protections extended to even the humblest members of society, including slaves and foreigners, demonstrated a conception of justice that transcended narrow ethnic or class boundaries. The synthesis of Christian faith with Germanic cultural traditions that the Anglo-Saxons achieved represents one of the most successful examples of religious and cultural integration in medieval European history. Rather than simply abandoning their ancestral heritage in favour of Mediterranean Christianity, the Anglo-Saxon peoples created a unique fusion that preserved the best elements of their warrior culture while transforming them according to Christian principles of love, mercy, and redemption. This synthesis produced distinctive forms of art, architecture, literature, and spiritual practice that influenced European Christian culture for centuries, while providing models for how diverse peoples could maintain their cultural identity within the universal framework of Christian civilization. The architectural legacy that Anglo-Saxon builders left throughout England demonstrates how successfully they adapted continental Christian building techniques to local conditions and traditions. The parish churches that still dot the English countryside with their distinctive stone towers and timber-frame naves represent a uniquely English contribution to Christian architecture that influenced church building throughout Northern Europe. The great stone crosses that marked sacred sites and cemetery grounds combined Germanic memorial traditions with Christian symbolism to create monuments that spoke simultaneously to ancestral reverence and Christian hope for resurrection. Artistic traditions developed in Anglo-Saxon scriptoriums and workshops achieved levels of sophistication that rivaled contemporary Byzantine and Carolingian examples, while maintaining distinctly English characteristics that reflected their Germanic heritage. The manuscript illumination produced in monasteries like Lindisfarne and Winchester combined Celtic interlace patterns with Germanic animal ornament and Mediterranean iconographic programs to create visual languages that were both thoroughly Christian and unmistakably English. The metalwork traditions that produced masterpieces like the Sutton Hoo treasure and the Fuller brooch demonstrated technical skills and artistic vision that influenced European decorative arts throughout the medieval period. Educational foundations established by Anglo-Saxon scholars created institutional models that influenced European intellectual development far beyond England's borders. The schools attached to cathedrals and monasteries throughout Anglo-Saxon England provided educational opportunities that were available nowhere else in contemporary Northern Europe, while the scholarly networks that connected English centres of learning with counterparts throughout the Christian world facilitated intellectual exchange that enriched European culture. The curriculum developed in Anglo-Saxon schools, with its combination of classical learning and Christian theology, vernacular literature and Latin scholarship, provided models for educational synthesis that influenced university development throughout medieval Europe. The idea of England itself, the conception of diverse peoples united by common law, language and loyalty, represents perhaps the most important cultural achievement of the Anglo-Saxon period. The transformation of Angles, Saxons, Jutes and Danes from competing tribes into a single English nation created precedents for national unity that would influence political development throughout the English-speaking world. This unity was not imposed through conquest or administration, but achieved through cultural synthesis that preserved local traditions while creating shared identities capable of transcending ethnic and regional boundaries. The rediscovery of Anglo-Saxon civilization through archaeological excavation and scholarly research has revealed the continuing relevance of their achievements to modern concerns about democracy, cultural identity, and human creativity. The treasures unearthed at Sutton Hoo in 1939 and the Staffordshire Hoard in 2009 have transformed contemporary understanding of Anglo-Saxon material culture while demonstrating the sophisticated artistic and technical capabilities that their society achieved. These discoveries continue to inspire artists, writers, and thinkers who find in Anglo-Saxon culture models for how human communities can balance individual excellence with collective responsibility, artistic achievement with practical necessity, cultural pride with openness to foreign influence. Literary rediscovery of Anglo-Saxon achievement, pioneered by scholars like J.R.R. Tolkien, who recognise the continuing power of Old English poetry and prose, has influenced modern literature in ways that extend far beyond academic study. Tolkien's scholarly work on Beowulf and other Anglo-Saxon texts provided the foundation for his own creative achievement in The Lord of the Rings and related works, demonstrating how ancient traditions could be transformed to address modern concerns while preserving their essential spiritual and emotional power. Contemporary writers continue to find inspiration in Anglo-Saxon literature, drawn to its combination of heroic idealism and tragic realism, its celebration of loyalty and courage, alongside its recognition of mortality and loss. Modern echoes of Anglo-Saxon political and legal traditions can be traced through the development of democratic institutions throughout the English-speaking world and beyond. The principles of consensual government, individual rights, and limited authority that first emerged in Anglo-Saxon England have influenced constitutional development in nations that have never experienced direct English rule, demonstrating the universal appeal of political ideas that balance freedom with order, rights with responsibilities, local autonomy with national unity. Language evolution from Old English to Modern English reveals the continuing vitality of linguistic patterns and structures established during the Anglo-Saxon period. While the vocabulary of English has been enriched by borrowings from dozens of languages, the fundamental grammar and syntax of the language remain essentially Germanic, preserving patterns of thought and expression that connect modern speakers with their Anglo-Saxon ancestors. The global spread of English as the lingua franca of international communication carries Anglo-Saxon linguistic heritage to every corner of the world, ensuring that their contribution to human civilization will endure as long as people continue to speak, write, and think in English. The continuing Anglo-Saxon spirit in the English-speaking world manifests itself in cultural attitudes and institutional practices that transcend national boundaries while preserving essential characteristics that can be traced back to the Germanic settlements of the 5th and 6th centuries. The emphasis on individual rights balanced with community obligations, the preference for pragmatic solutions over theoretical perfection, the commitment to legal process over arbitrary authority, the celebration of heroic achievement alongside recognition of human limitation. All these characteristics of Anglo-Saxon culture continue to influence how English-speaking peoples approach the challenges of modern life. As we stand in the 21st century, surrounded by technologies and facing challenges that the Anglo-Saxons could never have imagined, their legacy continues to shape how we think, speak, govern ourselves, and understand our place in the world. In every English word we speak, in every democratic assembly that gathers, in every legal principle that protects the weak against the strong, in every work of art that transforms ancient traditions to address contemporary concerns, the spirit of Anglo-Saxon achievement lives on. They came as strangers to a foreign shore and made it home. They faced overwhelming challenges and emerged stronger. They built not just in stone and timber, but in law and language, in custom and belief, creating foundations so solid that neither conquest nor time has been able to destroy them. The Anglo-Saxon achievement was not merely the creation of kingdoms that lasted 6 centuries, but the establishment of cultural and institutional traditions that have endured for more than a millennium and will continue to influence human civilization as long as people dream of freedom, justice, and the possibility of building better worlds through the marriage of ancient wisdom with contemporary innovation. In this sense, the Anglo-Saxon age never truly ended, it simply transformed, like their language and laws and literature, into something larger and more enduring than any single people or period could achieve. Their deepest victory was not won on any battlefield, but in the realm of the human spirit, where their vision of what life could be continues to inspire and challenge us all. And so we reach the end of our long journey through the mists of time, having walked alongside the Anglo-Saxons from their first tentative steps onto English shores to their final stand on the blood-soaked field at Hastings. in the quiet spaces of memory, where history becomes meditation and facts transform into something deeper than knowledge, we can sense the eternal presence of these remarkable people who gave so much to the world that we have inherited. Close your eyes now and let your breathing slow to match the ancient rhythms of the seasons that governed Anglo-Saxon life. Feel yourself drifting back across the centuries, not to any specific moment or place, but to something more enduring, the spirit that animated a people who refused to be defeated by any challenge, who transformed every obstacle into an opportunity for growth and renewal. In the darkness behind your eyelids, imagine the mist rising from the Somerset marshes where Alfred once hid, planning the salvation of his kingdom. See how that mist becomes the breath of scholars bent over vellum pages in candlelit scriptoriums, copying the wisdom of ages for generations yet unborn. Watch as it transforms into the morning fog that clung to the Thames as London merchants opened their shops, connecting England to the wider world through networks of trade and friendship. Feel the presence of all those Anglo-Saxon voices that still speak to us through their language, our language, every time we use simple words like home, love, hope, peace, strength. These are not mere sounds, but prayers whispered by farmers in their fields, songs sung by mothers to their children, oaths sworn by warriors facing impossible odds. They live within every English sentence, connecting us to ancestors whose names we will never know, but whose dreams we still carry forward. Listen to the silence between the words, where the Anglo-Saxon understanding of kingship as service still echoes in every democratic assembly, where their concept of law as something that protects rather than oppresses continues to shelter the innocent and restrain the powerful. In that silence lives their greatest gift, the idea that human communities can be built on consent rather than conquest, on justice rather than force, on hope rather than fear. As sleep begins to claim you, let your mind rest in the eternal Anglo-Saxon England that exists beyond the reach of Norman conquest or any earthly defeat. This is the England of the imagination, where Beowulf still battles monsters in the name of justice, where Alfred still kindles the flame of learning in dark times, where ordinary people still believe that wisdom and courage can overcome any challenge. In your dreams tonight, you may find yourself walking through villages where church bells ring across fields of golden wheat, where craftsmen work with patient skill to create beautiful things, where storytellers gather children around winter fires to pass on tales that connect the living with the dead and the dead with the eternal. Rest now in the knowledge that the Anglo-Saxon achievement was not a kingdom that lasted 6 centuries, but a vision of human possibility that will endure as long as people dream of building better worlds. Their truest victory was not won with swords, but with words, not in battles, but in the quiet persistence of those who believe that every ending is also a beginning, every defeat a preparation for ultimate triumph. Sleep peacefully, knowing that somewhere in the misty borderlands between waking and dreaming, the Anglo-Saxons continue their eternal journey, and we continue ours, guided by the light they kindled so long ago.